The summer of '08 was brutal on the interstate, especially running the western routes. The heat felt like a physical weight, pressing you into the vinyl seat for 12, 14 hours of stretch. I was hauling a load of dry goods from Seattle down toward Reading, a run I'd done a dozen times, but this time I decided to cut across one of those obscure timber roads in southern Oregon. It was supposed to shave off maybe 40 miles, but more than that, I just wanted to escape the monotony of the asphalt and the relentless sun. The road was called something generic, Forest Service Road 314, and it quickly narrowed into two rough lanes of cracked pavement. The trees here were something else entirely. Massive, ancient Douglas firs that stretched so high they blocked out most of the sky, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the afternoon. The air got noticeably cooler and heavier the deeper I drove, thick with the smell of pine sap and damp earth, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. It was deeply, profoundly quiet, the only sound being the slow, steady rumble of my own diesel engine. I was planning on pulling over around midnight to catch a solid 4 hours of sleep. I finally came across an old logging turnaround, a wide, semicircular gravel patch that hadn't been used in years. It looked perfect. That's when I noticed the other truck. It was parked 50 yards away, angled toward the trees. A vintage, long-nosed conventional rig, one of those heavy-duty models from the late 70s or early 80s. It was dark green, covered in a fine layer of dust and moss that suggested it hadn't moved in a very long time, maybe decades. No lights were on, and the cab windows were opaque with dirt. It was just sitting there, a massive, silent shadow against the black wall of the forest. I felt a prickle of unease. Out here, deep in the woods, you don't just abandon a rig like that. It's too valuable. But I was exhausted, and my brain started making excuses. Broken down, driver walked out for help, forgotten relic. I backed my own truck up, shut off the ignition, and the resulting silence was immediate and absolute, save for the faint, rapid ticking of my cooling engine. I locked my doors, set the alarm on my phone for 4 a.m., and tried to settle in. Sleep wouldn't come easy. The silence was too heavy, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see that shape, the abandoned truck, looming in my mind. I was drifting in that half-awake state around 2 a.m. when the silence was finally broken. It was a sound I knew intimately, the deep, mechanical heartbeat of a running diesel engine. But it was wrong. It was a low, constant rumble, faint enough that I almost convinced myself it was just the residual noise of my own rig, but it had a distinct, deep-throated quality that wasn't mine. It was coming from the direction of the old truck. I lifted myself up, careful not to make noise, and peered out my side window. Through the faint moonlight filtering down, I could clearly see the long nose of the derelict rig, and from its exhaust pipe, a plume of smoke was rising. It wasn't the white, heavy vapor of a cold start. It was a thin, bluish, ghostly cloud that hung still in the humid night air before slowly diffusing above the tree line. The engine was running, but the sound, it was what truly unsettled me. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic roar of a healthy truck engine at idle. This sound was off-key, uneven, almost struggling. It was too slow, a labored, deep chug-chug-chug that sounded less like a machine resting and more like a massive animal trying to take a breath underwater. It had an organic, wheezing quality to it that made my skin crawl. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Logic dictated I should get out and check, see if the driver had finally returned. But instinct, that primal fear that screamed stay inside, stay hidden, kept me frozen. I grabbed my powerful emergency flashlight and flashed my high beams at the parked rig. I held the bright, aggressive light on the cab for a solid 30 seconds, but there was no reaction. The idling sound continued its terrifying, slow rhythm, and the blue smoke kept curling into the night. It was as if the cab was empty, and whatever was running the truck was completely oblivious to the world outside, or simply didn't care. I pulled out my phone, thinking about calling the state police, but I knew the conversation would be useless. There's an old truck idling on an unmarked forest road. They'd probably think I was seeing things. But the sound was real, the smoke was real. After maybe 10 more minutes of that agonizing, wheezing sound, I had to know. I needed to see a face, confirm a driver, or at least confirm the truck was malfunctioning. I reached for the door handle, took a deep breath, and as my hand closed around the cool metal, the sound stopped. It wasn't a fade, and it wasn't a cough. It was an instantaneous, absolute cessation of noise, like someone had flipped a massive, silent switch. The deep, struggling rumble was gone, replaced once again by the heavy, suffocating silence of the forest. I looked at the exhaust pipe. The plume of bluish smoke was already dissipating, vanishing into nothingness. The truck was utterly still, utterly dark. I sat there for a minute, my hand still on the handle, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the engine had choked itself out. Maybe the ghostly blue smoke was just residual steam. But the speed of the silence was unnatural. It felt deliberate, like something had realized it was being watched and had simply chosen to cease its activity. Despite the fear, my curiosity was now a raw, burning need. I slipped out of my rig, trying to be as quiet as possible, though every crunch of gravel under my boots sounded deafening. The air immediately felt colder around me, denser. I grabbed my mag light, the beam cutting a thick, white line through the absolute darkness. I walked toward the abandoned truck, feeling incredibly exposed. As I got closer, the size of the machine was intimidating. It was old, the paint faded to a chalky green, and the windows were indeed caked with decades of grime. I approached the driver's side door, its handle looking pitted and cold. I raised the flashlight and carefully shone the beam into the cab. The seat was a cracked, old vinyl bench. It was empty. The steering wheel was enormous and dusty. The dashboard was a landscape of corroded gauges and ancient plastic. I checked the ignition. There were no keys hanging there and no sign of forced entry. I ran the beam over the passenger seat and the small, dusty sleeper bunk behind the seats. Nothing. No blankets, no gear, no sleeping bag, just dust and the silent impression of absolute neglect. I lowered the light to the engine. I pressed my palm flat against the massive cold hood. It should have been radiating heat if it had been running just moments before, even idling slowly. But the metal was stone cold, the same temperature as the forest air, cold as a tombstone. There was no warmth, no vibration, not the faintest scent of fresh diesel exhaust. The unsettling realization hit me. That truck hadn't been running. The sound I heard, the smoke I saw, it was not a functioning machine. It was a projection, a mimicry of life performed by an empty shell. Something had been pretending to breathe, struggling to hold onto a mechanical existence. And the moment it knew I was coming, it had stopped. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the cab windows. I felt a profound chill, deeper than the mountain air, as I imagined a ghostly hand reaching to shut off a phantom ignition, or worse, a silent, invisible presence still sitting in the driver's seat, watching me approach, and then simply deciding to stop. I got back in my own rig, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I didn't care about the risk of driving tired. I started my engine, pulled out onto the narrow road, and didn't stop until the weak rays of the morning sun finally broke through the eastern mountains. The next day, after dropping my load, I was at a Greasy Spoon in Klamath Falls, nursing a lukewarm coffee. I couldn't shake the image of that truck, and I finally worked up the courage to ask one of the old local truckers sitting at the counter. I described the exact location, the type of rig, a late 70s, long-nosed green conventional. The man, a grizzled old-timer named Ray, stopped stirring his coffee. The diner, which had been full of the usual morning clatter, suddenly went quiet around us. A couple of other regulars looked over. "You saw the old green one," Ray said, his voice flat. "Out by the old 45 logging turnaround." "Yeah," I confirmed, trying to keep my voice steady. It looked abandoned, but it was idling late last night, letting off smoke. Ray just shook his head slowly, a grim look on his face. "Son, that truck ain't idled since '83. That was Bill Tanner's rig. Bill was a quiet man, always on time. He pulled off that road one summer night, just like you did. Only Bill and his truck never came out. They found the rig a week later, parked exactly where you saw it. Doors locked, no sign of Bill, just his lunch thermos on the passenger seat." He paused, lowering his voice. "The odd thing was the engine. When the sheriff's department finally towed it out, they found the engine block was clean. Not a drop of oil, bone dry, and sea solid. Hadn't turned over in days, maybe weeks. No way it could have ever started. But the noise, I insisted, a lump forming in my throat. I heard it. I saw the exhaust smoke. Ray leaned closer, his eyes serious. The locals round here, we just know. That truck is parked, but it ain't empty. Bill Tanner never finished his route, and whatever happened to him, it left something behind in that engine bay. It gets lonely out there. Some nights, when a new rig pulls up for a rest, that old truck, it starts up, trying to breathe, trying to finish the haul. It just wants someone to see it, someone to notice the silence it can't quite maintain. You hear that sound, you don't investigate. You just leave. Because what you heard wasn't a broken engine, son. It was a mechanical ghost, and it was struggling to take its last breath right there in the dark. I finished my coffee in silence. The taste of stale diner brew suddenly like ash in my mouth. I kept running the route for years, but I never once took Forest Service Road 314 again, and every time I had to pull over for the night, I made sure I stopped somewhere bright, somewhere loud, somewhere far away from the kind of silence that could be so deliberately, horribly broken. Story 2. The summer heat had finally broken in the evenings, but the days were still long, and the air held a damp, suffocating weight that carried the scent of wet pine needles and decaying leaves. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment through the Panhandle National Forest in Idaho, a run that took me deep into the timber country. I'd been warned by my dispatcher to stick to the main roads, but I was running late and decided to risk a shortcut I found on an old paper map, a little used section of asphalt that promised to shave an hour off the trip. The road quickly deteriorated, becoming a winding, narrow lane cut through walls of dense, claustrophobic forest. There was no cell service, and the shadows from the evening sun stretched long and distorted across the hood of my truck. Around 11 p.m., I knew I had pushed my luck far enough. I spotted a faint, overgrown track branching off the main road, probably an old fire access trail, and decided to pull in and catch a few hours sleep. I backed my rig into the clearing, shut off the engine, and the resulting silence was so profound it hurt my ears. That's when I saw it. The remains of an old semi. It was tucked so far into the trees that I almost missed it, the color of its rusted metal blending perfectly with the dark underbrush. It was a skeletal wreck, a conventional cab rig with the hood long gone and the back wheels missing, the whole thing sunk axle deep into the dark, wet muck of the forest floor. It looked like a tomb. Morbid curiosity is a terrible thing when you're alone in the woods. I tried to ignore it, to close my eyes and sleep, but the hulk of the machine kept drawing my attention. After an hour of restless tossing, I gave in. I grabbed my heavy-duty LED work light and stepped out of my cab. The air was thick and cold, smelling strongly of mushrooms and something faintly metallic. I walked slowly toward the wreck. The light beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the decay. The side of the cab was peeling away, and the tires were nothing but shredded, rotted rubber. The driver's side door was open, hanging loosely on a single, groaning hinge. The faint breeze moving through the canopy made the door swing a fraction of an inch every few seconds, emitting a low, rusty creak, creak, creak that sounded disturbingly like an old man's labored breathing. I stepped up onto the rusted running board, holding my light steady. The cab interior was a disaster of dust, mold, and broken glass. It should have been empty, anonymous, discarded piece of machinery. But on the passenger seat, sitting right in the center of the cracked vinyl, was a small, leather-bound object. It was a logbook, the kind all long-haul truckers used before everything went digital. It was covered in a film of mildew, but unlike everything else in the cab, it looked surprisingly intact, almost preserved. It was clearly the driver's log, the final record of his run. I hesitated, feeling a deep sense of invasion, but the compulsion to know was too strong. I reached in, my fingers brushing the cool, damp leather. I pulled the book out and stepped back onto the forest floor, flipping it open near the wreck's rusted grill. The interior pages were brittle and yellowed, but the ink was remarkably clear. I skimmed the entries, each one neat and precise, detailing mileage, stops, fuel purchases, and times. The log was 20 years old, dating back to a midsummer run in the mid-90s. The entries were completely normal until the final week. The handwriting began to show an increasingly shaky quality, the lines becoming uneven. The entries were getting shorter, less descriptive. The second-to-last entry was just a single word under the remarks column: waiting. The final page, dated exactly 2 decades prior, was where the horror began. The top of the page started cleanly, logging the time and location. Pulled off FSR 12. Engine trouble. Calling dispatch. But then the writing broke down completely. It became a frantic, desperate scrawl covering the rest of the page. It wasn't writing, it was repetition. The word waiting was hammered onto the page over and over again, the pen digging deeper with each iteration, the lines overlapping in a dense, dark mesh. It looked like the final, maddening chant of a man losing his mind. Then, right across the center of that chaotic mess was a single, deep, clean cut that ran from edge to edge, gouging right through the page and into the paper beneath. It wasn't a tear. It was a deliberate, violent line, as if the driver had used something sharp and heavy to finally obliterate his own message. I stood there, staring at that final, broken line, the logbook heavy and cold in my hands. The silence of the forest seemed to press in on me. Amplified by the terror, I felt reading those desperate, repeated words. Waiting, waiting, waiting. And then I felt it. A distinct, cold pressure settled onto my right shoulder. It wasn't a sudden slap, but a slow, heavy placement, like a large, deliberate hand settling into place. It didn't feel threatening, not initially. It felt purposeful, like a guide. It was cold, unnaturally cold, a contrast to the humid air. And it was heavy, not crushing, but firm enough that I felt a slight, involuntary dip of my shoulder. It was telling me to look closer, to understand the message. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move my head, but my eyes darted sideways, trying to peer past the rim of my vision. I saw nothing but the dark outline of my own shoulder and the dark, tangled edge of the forest. Whatever it was tall, positioned perfectly to look down over me in the logbook. The touch was a violation of the isolation I had sought. I was alone, miles from anywhere, and something that was not a man, not an animal, and certainly not natural, was standing directly behind me, its cold weight resting on my body. The realization slammed into me. The driver had been waiting for something, and that something was still there, right now, sharing the logbook with me. In a pure surge of instinct, I spun violently, the flashlight beam whipping through the blackness. The intense light cut a blazing circle around the wreckage and the surrounding trees, momentarily blinding me to the subtleties of the darkness. There was nothing, no body, no shadow, no movement of leaves or brush. But as the light passed over the driver's open door, I saw a subtle movement inside the cab, a brief, faint disturbance of the ancient dust on the seat, as if something large had just quickly retreated from the light. I didn't waste another second. The cold pressure on my shoulder had vanished, but the memory of it was a searing reality. I dropped the logbook. It landed with a soft, dull thud on the wet ground, the final entry facing up, the word waiting, staring into the night. I scrambled back, not running blindly, but moving with a desperate backward intensity, keeping the beam of my light trained on the wreck. As I reached my own truck, fumbling for the door handle, I heard a sound from the wreckage. It was faint, but undeniably clear, a dry, scraping noise, followed by a slight metallic rattle. It was the sound of something heavy dragging itself out of the cab of the derelict rig, moving slowly, cautiously, toward the dropped logbook. I threw myself into my cab, slammed the door, and locked it before I even got into the seat. My hand was shaking too badly to turn the key right away. I forced myself to look in the side mirror, the powerful lamp on the side of my rig casting a harsh, orange glow on the area. The logbook was still there, lying open on the ground. But next to it, I saw a subtle darkening of the dirt, a wet smear forming, slowly spreading, as if the forest floor itself were bleeding. And just at the edge of the light, beneath the wreck, I saw a shadow that was too long, too low to the ground, and moving with an unsettling, fluid patience, heading toward that open leather book. I finally found the ignition, cranked the engine, and threw the big truck into gear. The tires spun briefly on the loose gravel before catching purchase. I didn't even attempt to turn around. I just pointed the nose of my rig back down the fire trail and floored it. I didn't look in my mirrors again. I drove faster than was sane on that crumbling road. The image of that frantic, scratched word waiting seared into my mind. The thing that terrified me the most wasn't the cold hand or the movement in the dark. It was the realization that the driver's logbook was a final, critical piece of evidence left for someone, anyone, to find. He was waiting for rescue, or maybe waiting for death, but the entity that kept him there recognized his final message, and it didn't want the message retrieved. Whatever that trucker was trapped with 20 years ago had noticed me. It knew I had read the final entry, and the cold pressure on my shoulder was the confirmation that its vigil was still ongoing, and now it knew exactly who was left with the knowledge of what it was still waiting for. I never reported the truck, never told anyone the full story of the logbook. Some secrets, especially those found in the deep, dark woods, are best left buried with the men who wrote them. Story 3. The Arizona high desert in August is a place of extremes. By day, the heat is a blinding, dry furnace. By night, once the sun drops, a profound, chilling silence descends, broken only by the sound of your own heartbeat. I was running a tough, unscheduled route, pushing my luck with the clock, hauling a load of pipe fittings destined for Phoenix. I was dead tired, past the point of being safe, when I finally decided to pull over. I spotted a faint dirt-access road winding off I-40, hidden behind a large, flat-topped mesa. It was deep, dark, and felt miles away from civilization, which was exactly what I needed. I killed the engine around 1:30 a.m. The stillness was immediate, heavy, and full of the scent of dust and juniper. I was just about to stretch out in the sleeper bunk when I noticed the other rig. It was parked maybe 70 yards away, half hidden by a stand of scrub brush and rock. It wasn't a wreck, but it was sitting in an odd, slightly tilted angle, completely dark. It was a flatbed trailer, and it was hauling a single, massive shipping container. The container was heavy-duty, older, painted an institutional olive drab, and completely devoid of any markings, numbers, or company badges. It looked like something the military would use, or something someone absolutely didn't want anyone tracing. My gut immediately told me to start my engine and leave. You don't see unmarked containers sitting abandoned in the desert. But my exhaustion won out. I figured it was a breakdown, and I wouldn't bother anyone if I just stayed quiet. I decided I'd at least walk over and make sure the driver was all right, maybe lend a hand if it was a simple fix. I grabbed my large, heavy mag light and stepped out into the dry, cool air. The tractor unit was a standard day cab, relatively new, but the windows were down a few inches, which struck me as odd in the desert. I peered through the glass. The keys were still in the ignition, resting in the off position. A half-eaten sandwich, wrapped haphazardly in wax paper, sat on the dashboard, and a travel mug was nestled in the cup holder. It looked like the driver had stepped out for a 30-second break and simply vanished. The interior wasn't dusty. It looked freshly abandoned. I shouted, "Hello? Everything okay?" The only reply was the low, resonant buzz of cicadas starting up in the distance. I walked back toward the trailer, my boots crunching rhythmically on the dry earth. That's when the sound started. It was low, rhythmic, and coming from inside the huge olive drab box. It sounded like a dry, heavy object being dragged slowly across a metal floor. A distinct SC charke noise repeated over and over. I stopped dead next to the container, running my hand over the cold, corrugated steel. The metal felt taut, vibrating slightly with the internal movement. I put my ear right up against the side of the box, trying to discern what kind of cargo could be making that noise. It felt too deliberate to be shifting equipment, too consistent to be a cage. Then I heard the voice. It was faint, dry, and impossibly close, resonating through the steel wall directly into my eardrum. It wasn't shouting, pleading, or struggling. It was a low, rhythmic whisper, the sound of dry air being forced past a parched throat. It was incomprehensible, a wash of sound, but it carried the chilling, undeniable cadence of human speech. It sounded like someone reading something terrible to themselves, over and over, trapped in the darkness. My blood ran cold. Was someone locked inside? Was it a hostage situation? "Hey," I yelled, banging hard on the side of the container. "Who's in there? Are you okay? I'm calling the police." The scraping noise instantly stopped. The rhythmic whispering ceased. The silence that followed was total, heavier than before, like a massive vacuum had just been created inside the box. I stood there, flashlight beam dancing nervously, waiting for a yell, a bang, or a desperate plea. Instead, the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't rhythmic. It was slow, agonizingly deliberate, and it coalesced into a single sentence. The voice was right up against the wall, dry as bone dust, and perfectly audible. It murmured, "You shouldn't have stopped." The words weren't a warning. They were a statement, an observation delivered with chilling finality. I felt a wave of nausea. I took a stumbling step back, my mind racing. If someone was trapped and injured, why wouldn't they yell for help? Why would their first words be an unervingly calm criticism of my presence? I shone the light beam frantically up and down the length of the container. The hinges on the back doors looked massive, secured by heavy, rusty steel bars. There was no obvious way in. I was about to turn and run when the voice spoke again, quieter this time, like a secret being confessed directly to me. I couldn't make out the whole sentence, but I heard the tail end of it, a final, chilling syllable that pierced the darkness. "They're waiting for Mark. My name is Mark." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a guess. It was a chilling, personal acknowledgement delivered from inside that cold, dark, unbadged metal box. I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck, realizing whatever was inside, whispering, wasn't just a trapped person. It was fully aware of my identity, and it was telling me that I was the reason the driver had left, or the reason the truck had been parked, and that the cargo was now expecting me. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered on the rocks, the beam shooting wildly into the air before settling on a patch of dust. I didn't care. I bolted. I ran back to my rig with a blind, desperate speed I didn't know I possessed, not sparing a single glance back at the olive drab container. I jumped into my cab, fumbling the key into the ignition. I started the engine, threw the gears, and peeled out of that turnaround, gravel spraying everywhere. I didn't slow down until I hit the interstate, and even then, I kept the speed higher than I should have. I drove until the blackness of the desert night began to fade, replaced by the bruised purple and pink of the sunrise. I kept my rearview mirrors focused on the empty road behind me, but every few miles, I'd glance quickly at the passenger side mirror, expecting to see a flash of dull green metal, or worse, the shape of the empty truck gaining on me. When I finally pulled into a busy, brightly lit truck stop diner in the morning, I tried to rationalize it all away. Maybe the driver's name was also Mark. Maybe I had misheard the word, twisting a random syllable into my own name in my terrified state. But the chilling clarity of that final whisper and the unnerving context of the abandoned cab, the keys left in the ignition, and the fresh sandwich wouldn't allow it. The driver hadn't just broken down or abandoned his rig. He had been summoned away from his lunch by a realization, and the thing he was hauling had immediately claimed the territory. I called my dispatcher from a payphone. I told him I saw an abandoned rig on an unmarked road and gave the approximate location. I didn't mention the container, the whispers, or the name. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. A few weeks later, a state trooper called me back. They found the truck, he said, but the flatbed trailer was empty. No container, no trace of the olive drab box. The tractor unit itself was towed away, logged as an unexplained abandonment. The driver was never found, and the authorities had no record of the origin or destination of a strange cargo. But I know what happened to that cargo, and I know what happened to the driver. The trucker was taken by whatever was inside that box, taken because he stopped, and his empty rig was left as a subtle, terrifying marker. That chilling, dry voice from the metal box knew exactly who I was, and it had simply stated the terrible truth. They're waiting for Mark. I live every day knowing that somewhere in the vast, desolate stretches of this country, a large olive-drab shipping container is rolling along, its final, intended destination still unreached, and the silent, patient entities within are still waiting for me to pull over again. That's a burden of knowledge I wouldn't wish on anyone. Story 4. The summer was winding down, clinging to the humid air over northern Wisconsin. I was running a late, routine fuel haul, the kind of night where the heat doesn't really break even after midnight. The road I was on, Highway 13, just south of Ashland, was surrounded by dense, relentless forest, endless miles of thick pine and birch. It was a dark road, the kind where the trees lean in close, swallowing the meager light from your high beams. The whole run felt suffocatingly quiet, a deep, heavy silence that always seems to precede something bad. I was maybe 10 miles from my next fuel stop when I saw it. It was the trailer first, a massive, gleaming silver tanker sitting awkwardly half on the shoulder, half in the ditch. It was disconnected, standing on its landing gear, abandoned. It was far too big and too pristine to be an ordinary wreck. You don't just ditch a fuel tanker. It's a specialty piece of equipment, and this one was reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural, almost alarming brightness. My immediate thought was a highway robbery or a severe mechanical failure. I pulled my own rig over carefully, parking a good 100 feet away. I grabbed my powerful industrial flashlight and stepped out into the humid, sticky air. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not fuel, but a sharp, coppery odor, metallic and unpleasant, mingled with the thick scent of pine and damp earth. I walked toward the abandoned tanker. It was a massive cylinder, secured firmly with chains. I checked the back, shining my light over the coupling point. The fifth wheel on the trailer was empty, the air lines neatly coiled and capped. The tractor unit was gone, but then I saw the tracks. The dirt shoulder here was soft and muddy, and pressed deep into the earth were the unmistakable, thick tread marks of heavy-duty truck tires. They weren't turning or sliding. They were straight and clear, and they didn't lead down the road. They led away from the scene, right off the shoulder and into the pitch-black woods. The tracks were fresh, the mud still glossy and undisturbed by dust. I followed them with my flashlight beam. They led into a faint old logging trail, completely overgrown, the kind of path you couldn't drive a Honda on, let alone a semi. The driver must have walked away, I reasoned, but why would he drive the tractor into the forest, away from the main road, instead of taking it for help? I followed the tracks, maybe 30 feet into the deepening gloom. The thick canopy above was almost completely blocking the faint moonlight. I could still hear the distant drone of the highway, but here, the silence was intense, broken only by my own heavy breathing and the squelch of my boots in the mud. The tracks continued, perfectly straight, crushing small saplings and snapping dry underbrush with frightening indifference. I stopped abruptly. The air in front of me felt colder, and I knew I wasn't alone. Deep in the woods, maybe 60 yards ahead, I saw a light. It wasn't the weak, diffuse glow of a distant porch lamp, and it wasn't the scattered, dancing beam of a flashlight. It was two perfect, unwavering circles of bright yellow light, spaced exactly the width of a truck's headlights. They were positioned low, right above the undergrowth, staring directly at me through the screen of trees and vines. My first thought was that the driver had walked into the woods, realized he was lost, and was flashing his cab lights to signal me. "Hello," I shouted, cupping my hand around my mouth. "Are you okay? I'm a trucker. Need help." The only response was the deep, unsettling silence of the woods. The lights didn't move, and I heard no engine, no voice, no crunch of tires on the earth, just the intense, steady, aggressive stare of those two yellow eyes. I pulled out my phone, no signal, of course. I took a hesitant step closer, shining my mag light directly into the lights, trying to overpower them, trying to catch the shape of the truck behind them. My powerful beam seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness, unable to penetrate the thick yellow glare. Then, one of the lights blinked. It flickered off completely, then immediately flared back on, brighter, more focused than before. As it came back on, the twin lights moved. They didn't roll forward, they simply reappeared instantly, maybe 10 feet closer to me. The movement was silent, impossible, and absolutely deliberate. My fear shifted from concern for a stranded colleague to pure, paralyzing dread. That wasn't a driver signaling for help. That was something observing me, something that was operating the abandoned truck's headlight system, but without the need for an engine or tires or even footsteps. I shouted again, my voice shaking. "Who's there? Show yourself." The only response was the sound of the lights blinking again, off, and then back on, another 10 feet closer. This process repeated, silent, steady, relentless. They were advancing on me, not with the noise of machinery, but with the cold, patient logic of an entity that didn't need to obey the laws of physics. I could now see the vague, immense silhouette behind the lights, the high, blocky shape of a conventional cab rig, the same one that belonged to the abandoned tanker. But the forest floor was too dense, too soft for a 40,000-pound vehicle to move through without making a horrific grinding noise, let alone the complete, total silence I was experiencing. I realized the horrifying truth. The cab hadn't been ditched so the driver could seek help. The cab had left. The driver had been removed, and something else had climbed into the seat and driven the tractor unit off-road, not to escape, but to hide, and now, to observe. And that thing, sitting silently behind the thick glass, knew I was standing right where the driver had originally abandoned his trailer. The lights blinked a fifth time, and they were close now, maybe 20 feet away. I could feel the heat radiating off the yellow beams, and I thought I could make out a faint, dark smudge behind the glass of the windshield. It wasn't a face, just a gap in the light, a darkness that was somehow darker than the night itself. I spun around and ran. I didn't look back until I reached my own truck. I ripped the door open, threw myself inside, and locked the door with a loud thunk. I cranked the ignition and threw the gears without waiting for the air pressure to build up. As I pulled out onto the shoulder, I dared a quick glance into my side mirror. Through the trees, right at the edge of the clearing where the silver tanker sat, those two perfect yellow circles were staring out. They were stationary now, positioned perfectly on the edge of the darkness, watching my departure. I floored the pedal, throwing the truck onto the highway. I drove hard for maybe half an hour before the shaking in my hands subsided enough for me to look properly at the passenger side mirror. I watched that mirror obsessively, waiting for the reflection of those two silent, yellow eyes gaining on me. They never did, but as the first pale light of the pre-dawn filtered over the horizon, washing the sky in gray and pink, I looked one last time. The lights were gone. However, where the reflection of the road should have been perfectly clear, I saw a faint, unsettling distortion, a kind of shimmering ripple like heat coming off the asphalt, except it was cold. And within that shimmer, for just a fleeting second, I saw a ghostly, high-set reflection that was not my truck, not the road, but the vague, high-up outline of cab's windshield and the dark, empty space behind it. I pulled into the Ashland fuel stop, completely drained. I never reported the encounter. How could I? A silent truck tried to follow me through the woods. I know I left a man's tanker trailer sitting there, possibly with vital evidence. But the dread of those lights was more powerful than any civic duty. I never found out who the driver was or what was hauling that immense silver cylinder. All I know is that the machine was waiting for its next victim, and it had briefly decided that its next route was following me. And somewhere in those dense Wisconsin woods, the abandoned trailer is still standing guard, waiting patiently for the return of the silent, headlight-eyed cab that drove itself away. Story 5. The Nevada desert is a deceptive place at night. You think of silence, of vast, empty space, but when you're pulled off the main highway, the silence becomes loud, filled with the static buzz of the millions of tiny insects and the hollow howl of the wind rushing over the scrub. It was late, past 3 a.m., and I was miles from any town, hauling a specialized piece of mining equipment that required me to avoid the major way stations. I saw an unmarked, dusty pull-off, just a patch of gravel and packed earth behind a low line of eroded boulders, and decided to risk an hour or two of sleep. I was running on fumes and instinct. As I angled my truck into the clearing, my headlights illuminated a dark, hunched shape already occupying the best spot. It was a massive, hulking heavy-haul rig, the kind used for oversized loads, but this one was ancient, rusted to a deep, ruddy brown, and angled awkwardly against a rock face as if it had been pushed there by a forgotten storm. It looked utterly derelict, like a prehistoric beast that had finally slumped down to die. The tires were flat, the chrome was pitted, and the windows were opaque with years of baked-on dust. It had clearly been sitting there for decades. I parked a safe distance away and shut down my engine. The sudden, profound silence after hours of diesel rumble felt like a physical weight settling on me. As the internal noises of my own cooling truck died down, a strange, distinct odor began to permeate the air. It wasn't the usual desert scent of dust and ozone. This was a potent, unsettling blend. The sharp, acrid bite of old, spilled diesel fuel that had soaked into the earth, mixed with something else. Something metallic and sickly sweet. A thick, cloying smell that immediately brought a cold prickle of recognition. It was the smell of old blood, dried and dusty, but still heavy and unmistakable. The kind of scent that tells you something terrible happened here a long, long time ago. I grabbed my heavy-duty mag light, intending only to take a quick look to confirm my unsettling suspicion and then leave. If this place was marked by death, I didn't want to be sleeping here. I walked slowly toward the derelict rig, the crunch of my boots on the gravel sounding deafening in the stillness. The driver's side door of the heavy haul was hanging open, swinging slightly on its rusted hinges, scraping a faint, dry shhd sound on the dry dirt with every movement of the breeze. I approached cautiously, shining my light into the cab. The interior was a wasteland. The passenger seat foam was exposed, the vinyl cracked into 100 pieces, and everything was covered in a thick, uniform layer of fine, red desert dust and cobwebs. But on the driver's side floor, beneath that heavy layer of dust, I could clearly see a stain. It was a deep, dried-up maroon color, a dark patch that had soaked deep into the cracked vinyl of the floor mat and seeped down into the metal beneath. It wasn't oil. The size and shape, the way it had dried, was too organic, too final. It was the source of that terrible, sickly sweet smell. The driver, whoever he was, had clearly been injured, violently, right there at the controls. I leaned back out, the air feeling suddenly thin, trying to gather my composure. This wasn't just an abandoned truck. It was a crime scene from 20 years ago, still reeking of the violence that took place. I was about to turn and retreat when I heard it. It came from the opposite side of the truck, the passenger side, away from the open door. It was a wet, dragging sound, low and heavy like something being slowly pulled across the rough ground. It was distinct, deliberate, and happening right now in the silence. SHHHKK. SHHHKK. My heart seized up. I spun around, raising the heavy mag light and aiming the powerful beam at the ground near the passenger side of the cab. I expected to see a coyote, a wild animal, maybe a bag of trash being dragged by the wind. What I saw made my blood run cold and static. Right at the base of the passenger footwell, where the dry dirt met the remnants of the asphalt, I saw a smear. It was a fresh, dark streak, a viscous, liquid trail that contrasted sharply with the pale, dried dust of the pull-off. It wasn't dripping or pooling. It was a line of liquid being actively, steadily pushed or dragged from the cab, across the ground, and heading directly into the dense, low-scrub brush bordering the clearing. The trail was thick, dark red, and it was moving. I stood frozen, the beam of my light locked on the terrifying, slow motion of that dark, wet smear. It was moving too slowly to be an animal escaping, too perfectly linear to be an arbitrary spill. It was as if something heavy and wet inside the passenger footwell was being pulled, or was pulling itself, out of the truck and into the darkness. It wasn't dripping. The stain I saw was the material itself being extruded by movement, slowly drawing itself toward the shelter of the brush. The source of the movement was hidden by the rusted cab, obscured by the wide, flat wheel arch of the derelict rig. I didn't see a hand, a foot, or any body part, just the terrifying, deliberate advance of that slick, dark trail across the dirt. It looked exactly like the dark, metallic fluid that had stained the driver's floor. Only this was fresh, and it was going somewhere. I stood there, hyperventilating, the silence once again amplifying the faint drag sound coming from the hidden side of the truck. The sound felt closer now, the smear advancing faster, pulling itself into the anonymity of the shadows. It dawned on me. The driver had died on the left side, leaving that massive, dried stain. But whatever had happened to him, whatever had attacked him or drained him, had used the passenger side to exit, and it was still moving, still leaving its mark. And that sickly sweet, old blood smell was the lingering residue of the original attack, a signpost for the fresh, silent exit happening right now. I felt a sudden, profound terror that if I moved my light or took one step toward the front of the truck to see the source, the smear would stop, and whatever was making it would launch itself at me. The deliberate, silent nature of the movement was the scariest part. It wasn't panicked. It was efficient, patient, and aware that I was watching its slow departure. I backed up, taking small, slow steps, never lifting the light from the smear. I kept the powerful beam locked on that terrifying, slow-motion trail of dark fluid until it finally slipped entirely into the dense shadow of the creosote bushes, vanishing into the Nevada night. The dragging sound stopped the instant the trail disappeared. The silence returned, complete and heavier than before. I ran the final distance back to my truck, scrambled into the cab, and locked both doors. I started the engine, the sudden roar shattering the oppressive silence. I didn't wait to turn around. I pulled out onto the main road, the massive engine screaming under the load. I drove until the sunrise bleached the sky white, painting the desert in colors too bright and normal to hold such a dark memory. I never stopped driving until I hit a major city. I never told the full story to the police or anyone, just mentioning an old, rusted rig that smelled of fuel and decay. But I know the truth. That hulking truck was a trophy, and its cab was a repository for a decades-old crime. And whatever was responsible for the violence hadn't gone away. It had simply been resting, and the moment I pulled up and turned off my light, it had begun its slow, unseen exit, dragging its dark, viscous self out of the old rig and into the scrub, leaving a fresh trail right across the exact spot where I had chosen to stop and rest. I still smell that metallic sweetness sometimes, even miles away, and I know that whatever was driven into the desert and left to rot, something else found it, consumed it, and is still using the wreck as a base for its slow, silent hunts. Story 6. The endless flatlands of eastern Montana, especially late at night in August, possess a kind of cold, quiet dread that gets under your skin. The summer heat had finally cracked, leaving the air dry and perfectly still, the kind of night where every star is visible and the horizon seems to stretch into infinity, emphasizing how small and alone you really are. I was running a long, boring midnight haul, heading eastbound on an old state route that ran parallel to the interstate. It was a stretch of highway where you might see 2 cars an hour, and my only companion was the faint, predictable hiss of my own CB radio, tuned to the trucker's standard channel 19, which was predictably empty. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I saw the wreck. It was pulled far onto the overgrown shoulder of the road, an old, boxy orange cab-over rig, the kind that had been retired 20 years ago. It wasn't a fresh wreck. It was clearly derelict, rusted and gutted, with the tires flat and the doors missing entirely. I slowed down, morbidly curious. It looked like something that had simply been pushed out here and forgotten. The sight of a relic like that, sitting dead on the edge of the prairie, always gives you a chill. It's a reminder of how quickly you can disappear out here. I was about to accelerate past it when I caught a flicker of sound over the rush of my own engine noise. It was a faint, high-pitched hiss that wasn't coming from my CB. It was coming from the wreck. I pulled over, parked about 50 yards down the road, and killed my engine. The immediate silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic clicking of my cooling engine and that strange, faint sound. I grabbed my heavy mag light and walked back toward the dead truck. As I got closer, the sound resolved itself. It was the unmistakable white noise, the static hiss of a CB radio tuned to an empty frequency. This was profoundly unsettling. The truck was a rusted skeleton. The doors were gone. The dash was exposed to the elements. And yet somehow, its ancient radio was on. I climbed up onto the running board, bracing myself against the gaping void where the door should have been. The cab smelled of dry dust, mildew, and stale cigarettes. The dash was a mess of torn wires and broken plastic, but there, mounted stubbornly beneath the bare console, was the CB radio unit. It was old, cream-color plastic, and it was indeed on. The volume knob was almost fully turned, and the little channel display glowed a faint, sickly orange. 19. The static filled the cab, loud and abrasive, an aggressive, continuous SHHHHHH. I leaned in, shining my flashlight directly onto the speaker grill. I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe some freak wiring short? But even if the battery survived 20 years of exposure, how could the radio unit itself still function in this damp, freezing hot environment? As I stood there, mesmerized by the sheer impossibility of the thing, I realized the noise wasn't just static. Layered underneath the high-frequency hiss, blending with it so perfectly that you had to strain to notice, was something else. A low, wet, rhythmic sound. It was labored, heavy, and undeniably organic. It sounded like air being pulled into and violently expelled from a large cavity. A deep, ragged T-char-hiss. T-char-hiss. It was the sound of heavy, uneven breathing, impossibly close, right there in the dead cab with me. The realization hit me with a physical force. I was standing next to an abandoned truck whose radio was broadcasting the sounds of an occupant struggling for air. And whatever was making that sound was sitting just out of sight in the shadows of the empty sleeper bunk behind the seats. My body was frozen, caught between the urge to bolt and the need to confirm what I was hearing. I forced my eyes to sweep the dark rectangle of the bunk, but it was just a pit of shadow and dust. The breathing, however, continued, a wet, panicked rasp that seemed to vibrate in the empty seat right next to me. In a moment of pure, blinding panic, I reached out my hand toward the volume knob, desperate to silence the terrifying sound. I had to make it stop. My fingers brushed the cold, sticky plastic of the knob, and the breathing sound stopped. It didn't fade. It didn't cough or catch. It just instantly, completely cut out, leaving only the relentless, high-pitched, white noise of the static. The silence was immediate and absolute, and it felt heavy, watchful. I kept my hand hovering near the knob, not daring to move. For a long, agonizing moment, the CB hissed, the only sound in the entire world. And then, from the speaker, a voice emerged. It was dry, low, and hollow, like gravel rolling inside an empty oil drum. It was right there, whispering from the relic on the dash. The voice was slow, deliberate, and spoke only 2 words. "You're late." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a threat of violence. It was an accusation, a statement of fact delivered with the chilling finality of a judge. "You're late." I instantly recognized the meaning. This message wasn't for me, not entirely. It was meant for the original driver of this orange cab over, the man who had abandoned it, the man who had promised to return, or perhaps the man who was supposed to pick him up. The truck had been waiting for him for 2 decades, tuned to that empty frequency, struggling to breathe, and now, I, a random passing trucker, had stumbled into the silence and become the recipient of its final, damning message. The message of an endless wait that had just been broken. My mind screamed one thought. Whatever had been waiting had just realized that the wrong person had shown up. I snatched my hand back from the radio knob, my skin crawling with the dry rasp of the static that now felt like a physical thing rubbing against me. I didn't turn around, I didn't look in the sleeper bunk again, and I didn't touch the door frame. I simply stepped backward off the running board, my eyes fixed on the illuminated dash and the glowing Channel 19. The radio hissed relentlessly. The silence in the cab was palpable, but I could feel the intense, focused attention of whatever had whispered that message. It was right there, sitting in the dark, waiting for my next move. I backed away slowly, deliberately, not wanting to spook the invisible presence. Every dry crunch of gravel felt like an explosion. I didn't look back at the wreck until I was safely inside my own rig, the doors double-locked. I started my truck, pulled out, and drove away without looking in the mirror. I drove for over an hour before I risked turning my own CB volume up. Channel 19 was still empty, only the familiar, non-threatening white noise. But now, that sound, that hiss of empty air, carried a new, terrifying implication. It wasn't just static. It was the background noise of the abyss. And sometimes a voice breaks through it just long enough to tell you what you don't want to hear. I never forgot that voice. Dry, hollow, accusatory. I think that truck had been waiting for its driver, or perhaps its next cargo, for 20 years. And when I turned off my engine, I had briefly fooled the residual presence into thinking the wait was over. But when I reached for that knob, I proved I wasn't the right man. And the voice made it clear. Someone was expected, and they were late. And I had just confirmed to the thing in the cab that the wait would continue indefinitely in the silent, star-filled darkness of the Montana flatlands. Story 7. The roads in upstate New York, once you get far enough into the wilderness, start to feel ancient and closed in. It was a late summer run, and I was pushing through the Adirondack foothills, the black pavement winding through dark tunnels of maple and hemlock. The isolation was profound. No lights, no towns, just the oppressive silence of the mountains pressing in around the cab. I've been driving since noon, and my eyelids were getting heavy. I knew I needed to stop. I spotted an old, faded blue sign for a scenic rest area that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the Nixon administration. I pulled off onto a crumbling asphalt lot. The place was completely overgrown, weeds pushing up through the cracks, a picnic table half swallowed by kudzu, and a restroom facility that looked more like a mausoleum. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of pine mulch and something vaguely metallic like stale water. There was only one other vehicle in the lot, parked in the far corner where the pavement dissolved into the forest floor. It was an old-day cab truck, a mid-90s model, pulling an empty flatbed. But what was unusual was the sleeper. It was a small, aftermarket box bolted onto the back of the cab, the kind of cheap fiberglass unit you'd buy from catalog. The whole rig looked surprisingly clean, not rusted like a wreck, but utterly static. It was just sitting there, completely devoid of life or movement. No curtains in the windows, no bungee cords holding the airlines, just still. I parked maybe 50 feet away, shutting off my powerful diesel engine. The silence rushed in, and immediately I felt the familiar, unwelcome prickle of being watched. It wasn't the paranoia of fatigue. It was a specific cold feeling directed from the dark hulk of the other truck. I tried to ignore it, pulling the shades and settling into my bunk. But every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the intense, silent scrutiny radiating from that small, dark sleeper box. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep. The feeling of being watched had become an agonizing pressure on my chest. I rationalized that I needed to check the truck, maybe see if the driver was ill, or if it was just an empty curiosity fueling my unease. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of my rig. The air was cold enough now to make me shiver. I walked slowly, quietly across the cracked asphalt toward the old-day cab. As I got closer, the stillness of the vehicle was remarkable. The windows of the cab and the small sleeper were completely opaque, layered with a fine gray dust and heavy condensation from the night air. The tires were slightly low, but not flat. It looked like the truck had been parked, switched off, and then left alone for maybe a decade. I approached the sleeper bunk first. It was a tight coffin-like space designed just for one man to lie down. I cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed my face against the small, dusty window pane to try and peer into the darkness. I shined my flashlight beam through the gap created by my hands, pushing past the grime and condensation. Inside, the light revealed a small, built-in mattress, an ancient, faded piece of thin foam. Everything, the walls, the ceiling, the mattress, the floor, was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of fine, undisturbed gray dust. It was the kind of powdery dust that settles over months, even years, undisturbed by breezes or movement. It was a picture of perfect, long-term abandonment. But then I saw it, right in the very center of the foam mattress, where a person's torso and hips would naturally rest. There was a perfectly clear, dust-free indentation. It wasn't a hole. It was an absence of dust, a clean, human-shaped depression in the blanket of gray. It looked like someone had been lying there for a long time and had just gotten up, or maybe just shifted their weight. The surrounding dust was untouched, pristine, meaning the person hadn't used the narrow gap between the bed and the wall to climb in. They had simply materialized or been lying there since the dust settled. A profound, sickening wave of realization washed over me. The occupant of that space was either still there or had been there until moments ago, and the truck hadn't been abandoned for a decade. It had been occupied, silently, motionlessly, while the world outside gathered dust. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and ran the tip of one finger across the dusty glass of the window pane, disrupting the years of grime right above the dust-free spot. I did it not out of curiosity, but out of a desperate, panicked need to connect with the terrifying reality I was witnessing. In the instant my finger disturbed the dust, scratching a clean streak on the outside of the glass, I heard a sound from inside the sleeper. It was small, sudden, and impossibly close. A muffled, wet, involuntary sound. A cough. It was a soft, deep, hacking noise, the sound of someone whose lungs were heavy with fluid or dust, a biological, guttural reaction to the disturbance I had just made. The sound was quickly, instantly suppressed, ending with a faint, wet gasp. But it had happened. Something living, or something mimicking life, was lying just inches from my face, and it had reacted to my touch. I yanked my hand back as if the glass were hot iron, the hair standing straight up on my neck. I looked again, scrambling to find the source of the sound in the darkness behind the window, but the glass was now smeared, and the small, dark sleeper interior remained a silent void. The only physical proof was the indentation. The clear, dust-free spot on the mattress was still there, utterly silent, waiting. Whatever had coughed was still lying down, still resting its weight in that perfectly clean spot, completely motionless, but acutely aware of my presence. The silence that followed the cough was the deepest, most terrifying silence I have ever known. It wasn't empty. It was the silence of something holding its breath, waiting for the threat to pass. I backed away slowly, meticulously, never turning my back on the sleeper window. I didn't dare run, didn't want to provoke whatever was watching from inside that dark, dusty chamber. I retreated to my rig, climbed in, and locked the doors, throwing the curtains shut with violent haste. I sat there, frozen for the rest of the night. I didn't try to sleep. I just watched the thin gaps in my curtains, listening. I didn't hear an engine start, didn't hear a door open, didn't hear a footstep on the gravel. But every minute, I felt that profound, chilling weight of scrutiny. The knowledge that the occupant of that small, dusty bed was awake, completely still, and intensely focused on my presence. As the sun finally began to rise, painting the eastern sky a faint, sickly gray, I started my truck, the noise feeling like a terrible violation of the stillness. I pulled out onto the road and drove away, never looking back in my mirrors. I never stopped driving that day, passing truck stops and rest areas without a second thought, pushing myself until I was hundreds of miles from those dark Adirondack foothills. I never found out who that driver was, or what he was hauling, or why he was forced to spend years in a coffin-like sleeper, waiting for the dust to settle around him, only to have his silence broken by a cough. But I know the truck is still there, pulled into that old, forgotten rest area, and that the single clean spot in the dust remains. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my cab at night, I feel the cold pressure of unseen eyes and hear the phantom sound of dry air hacking in the dark, reminding me that some people never leave their rigs, even long after they're gone. Story 8. The humidity in the Louisiana bayou in late summer isn't just a condition. It's a living, breathing weight that settles on you, smelling of sulfur, stagnant water, and decaying vegetation. I was running a delivery down a backwoods route, navigating the serpentine mess of old parish roads and service trails that web through the swampy lowlands. The air was so thick you could almost chew it, and the mosquitoes were relentless. The isolation down here felt oppressive, the cypress trees draped in moss like shrouds, the black water lurking just beneath the road's edge. I was exhausted, needing 15 minutes to just clear my head and get some warm soda down. I pulled off onto a barely used gravel spur, a narrow, cracked concrete slab that looked like it led to an abandoned oil pump. That's where I found the other truck. It was a beat-up, late-model Kenworth cab-over, completely oxidized and covered in a sickly green layer of mold. It was sunk deep into the muck off the concrete edge, tires half submerged in the black sludge. It had clearly been left for dead a long time ago. I parked my rig and cut the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy. I was sitting there, trying to enjoy my break, watching the water ripple faintly in the drainage ditch, while my attention settled on the derelict cab-over, specifically the passenger side door. It was slightly ajar, maybe a 2-inch gap that exposed the darkness inside the ruined cab. I watched it for a minute, assuming the hinges were just too rusted to hold it closed. But then, as I watched, the door began to move. It didn't swing quickly like it was caught by a gust of wind. It moved with an agonizing, almost painful slowness, pushing past the rusted resistance of its own hinges. It took maybe 30 seconds, but the door slowly, silently swung all the way open until it rested flat against the side of the cab. Then it stopped, hanging there loosely, rocking slightly in the heavy, humid air. I leaned forward, genuinely startled. It was too controlled to be the wind. The air was nearly still. I told myself maybe the ground was shifting, causing the wreck to settle, releasing pressure on the door. I waited, watching the dark, moldy opening of the cab. After a few minutes, the door started to move again. This time, it began to close itself. It was the same agonizingly slow, deliberate motion. The hinges groaned, a faint, metallic complaint that was barely audible over the insect buzz. It didn't rush or speed up. It moved with the steady, measured certainty of a hand guiding it shut. I could almost visualize the invisible presence leaning its weight against the doorframe, ensuring the closure was perfect. Finally, the door reached the latch, and with a solid, definitive thud, it clicked shut. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs, the warm soda forgotten in my lap. It wasn't the sound that terrified me. It was the precision. The door hadn't been slamming randomly. It had been opened and then closed, with the care and certainty of someone finishing an action. It felt like an intimate act, witnessed in the deep, isolated silence of the bayou. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe some bizarre thermal expansion or a rusted coil slowly unraveling. But it was too perfect. After a few more minutes of tense silence, the process began again. Slowly, silently, the pressure holding the door closed was released, and the door cracked open, just that 2-inch gap. Then it began its slow, deliberate outward swing. It pushed open entirely, waited for a short, unnerving beat, and then the groaning hinges began their measured retreat, pulling the door back to its frame. Thud, click, shut. I couldn't move. I was watching a loop, a ritual being performed by an entity that didn't need hinges or motors to move a massive piece of rusty metal. It was acting out a routine. I watched it repeat the cycle 3 more times. Slowly opening, waiting, slowly closing, thud. It was the exact mundane rhythm of a long-haul trucker climbing in and out of his cab during a regular shift, multiplied and slowed down to a horrifying, ceremonial pace. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the door handle. As the door began its next opening cycle, I could clearly see the handle mechanism. It wasn't rotating. The door was being moved solely by force applied to the frame, as if an invisible, immense weight was leaning against it. As the door was in the middle of closing, groaning softly, I focused my vision on the small, dusty window glass. Just as the door was about to click shut, I thought I saw a reflection on the glass, a brief, muddy ripple of light that wasn't my own truck. And within that ripple, I thought I saw a momentary outline, a fleeting shape right in the driver's seat, looking out. It was a large, hunched form, completely colorless, a distortion of the light. When the door clicked shut, the reflection vanished. The form was gone. I threw the binoculars down, feeling a wave of nausea. I understood now. That trucker had been taken, or he had left, but something else had occupied his rig. And that something was stuck in an endless loop, performing the last, most basic act of the missing driver, over and over again, in the deep, damp bayou. It was an entity mimicking human life, demonstrating that it was the new occupant, performing the routine of the man it had replaced. On the seventh time the door began to open, I heard a different sound. Not the hinges groaning, but a faint, wet slap coming from inside the cab, right before the door fully opened. Then, when the door was fully open and waiting, I heard it again, a low, rhythmic slapping like a wet hand hitting the plastic dashboard, coming from the black interior. It was timed perfectly with the pause in the door cycle. I realized the invisible occupant wasn't just performing the ritual of entry and exit. It was celebrating its successful entrance, striking the dashboard in some kind of internal rhythm. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned the key and the diesel engine roared to life, shattering the stillness. I threw the transmission into gear, and as my wheels spun in the gravel, I glanced in my side mirror at the cab over. The passenger door was frozen halfway open, stuck in the waiting position. It didn't close. It had stopped its ritual, recognizing the noise and presence of a living human leaving its orbit. It was staring silently at my departure, the black maw of the open cab door a silent invitation. I drove out of there at a speed that was borderline reckless. I never stopped until I was on high, dry ground and the swamp smell was gone. I called the state police anonymously, telling them there was an abandoned rig that looked suspicious. I gave them the coordinates, but I never mentioned the door or the smell or the silent, rhythmic thud of the closing latch. I learned later that the police found the truck and eventually pulled it out. They never found the driver. They determined the rig had been parked there for over 15 years. But the detective on the case made a weird comment in the local paper, mentioning that the passenger door handle was so corroded it looked like it was fused to the frame, yet the door itself was found slightly ajar when they arrived, and they had a hell of a time getting it to stay closed during the tow. They wrote it off as a mechanical failure due to age. I knew better. I know that thing is still down there in the muck, and as soon as another rig pulls over for a break, that door will slowly, silently begin to open again, waiting patiently for its next occupant to witness its chilling, endless ritual. Story 9. The Arizona high desert, bordering the New Mexico line, gets deceptively cold in the summer when the sun is down. The air loses its searing heat and settles into a sticky, unsettling coolness, and the sky is so vast and black it feels like the universe is pressing down on the highway. I was pushing a midnight haul, running eastbound, trying to make good time. It was the kind of long, boring stretch where you start arguing with yourself just for company. I was maybe 50 miles from the next major town when I saw the silhouette of the Old Way station. It was abandoned, shut down for probably 30 years, but the concrete structure, a small, windowless building and a massive, low-scale pad, still stood right off the highway. It was tucked into a low rise, framed by sparse, rocky hills. I always felt a shiver passing it. These places where truckers spend their lives getting scrutinized and documented feel like holding cells, and seeing one standing empty, perpetually waiting, is just unsettling. My headlights swept over the deserted lane. I was already past the main building when the light caught something strange on the scale pad itself. It was a truck. It was an old, flat-fronted white Freightliner cab over, the kind with the sharp, boxy nose, painted a faded, anonymous blue. It was backed up perfectly onto the scale, its rear tandem wheels resting squarely on the metal pad. The cab was pitch black, and the entire rig was sagging heavily on its springs, clearly loaded with an immense, unidentifiable cargo. My first thought was that the state was finally doing some kind of late-night removal or maintenance, getting ready to tear the old station down. But the truck looked too old, too derelict, and the whole scene was too still. No lights, no yellow safety vests, no noise except the roar of my own engine as I passed. I glanced quickly into the passenger side mirror, getting a final look at the massive, dark shape squatting on the scale. As I sped past the way station structure, the moment my own trailer was exactly opposite the scale, my truck shuddered. It wasn't a violent jolt, but a brief, impossible tug backward, a sudden, heavy resistance that felt like someone had just clamped down on my rear bumper for a split second, then let go. At the same exact moment, my own air brakes hissed sharply, a loud PSSHD that sounded like an involuntary reflex. It was completely uncalled for. I hadn't touched the pedal. I gripped the wheel, adrenaline spiking. I looked wildly in my side mirror, trying to figure out what had caused the impossible drag. Through the dust cloud kicked up by my passing truck, I saw the white Freightliner. And inside its cab, a light flickered on. It was a dim, sickly green glow, just for a second, illuminating the interior with a faint, unsettling illumination before dying instantly. It was the color of an old, dying indicator bulb on an ancient dashboard. When the green light cut out, the profound silence of the desert night was broken by one final, chilling sound, a clear, distinct clunk-rattle-clunk. It was the sound of the old-style scale printer operating, the heavy, mechanical action of the internal measuring arm dropping, followed by the sound of a receipt being quickly torn off the spool. I drove on, the silence in my cab, now suffocating, the hairs standing straight up on my arms. I realized what I had just witnessed. When I passed the scale, my truck, my actual physical truck, had briefly triggered the invisible mechanism of the abandoned way station. That sudden drag, the hiss of my brakes, was the ghostly act of being weighed. And the phantom truck on the scale, the heavy, squatting Freightliner, was the ghost of the last truck weighed here before the station closed. The green light I saw was the phantom driver checking his dashboard for the weight reading. And the mechanical clunk was the ghost of the scale finishing its duty, printing the final, official weight of the abandoned, heavy rig that was stuck in an endless loop of inspection. I pulled over about a mile down the road, completely unable to drive any further. I shut off the engine and sat in the dark, trying to force logic onto the encounter. The air brakes? Just a pressure bleed. The drag? A bad patch of asphalt. But the light, the color, and the final clunk of the printer, that was too specific, too ritualistic to be coincidence. I knew I had to go back. I needed to see if the Freightliner was still there, or if my mind had completely broken from exhaustion. I turned my truck around slowly, my high beams cutting through the dust-filled air. As I approached the way station again, the headlights swept over the entire concrete structure. The scale pad was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No old Freightliner, no massive, sagging load, no dark shape. Just the cracked concrete pad, stretching silently into the dark. I stopped my rig directly opposite the scale pad. I didn't see anything, but I noticed something unusual on the asphalt apron leading up to the scale. It was a narrow, dark line, a streak of something black and oily, that ran from the highway and stopped abruptly just before the scale pad. It was too dark and straight to be a regular oil spill. It looked like the residue of an air hose, or perhaps the faint, lingering trail of a massive, heavily loaded set of tires that had just driven off. I got out of my truck, grabbing my flashlight. The air was cold, but the patch of asphalt near the scale pad felt strangely warm to the touch, almost radiating a faint heat. I shined my light onto the scale house window. It was opaque with dirt, but I could make out something taped to the inside glass, right where an official notice would hang. I climbed the steps to the deserted building, peering in. Taped to the dusty window was a piece of paper, thick and yellowed with age. It looked like a standard weigh receipt. The ink was faded but legible. I squinted, holding the mag light beam steady. The receipt was dated late in the summer of 1993, the exact year the station was rumored to have closed. The truck ID number was illegible, but the final, hand-stamped number at the bottom was perfectly clear. Weight, 80,000 pounds, max. And scrawled beneath that final, official stamp in faded pencil was a single, neat line of writing. Driver, F. O'Malley. Final destination, unknown. Must proceed. As I read the last words, I felt the profound, chilling pressure again, that sense of sudden, heavy weight settling over the concrete pad behind me. I heard a faint, quick whoosh of air, like a gigantic sigh, coming from the empty scale. I slowly turned around. The scale pad was still empty, but pressed into the thin layer of dust covering the concrete was a fresh set of tire tracks, massive, heavy-duty treads, running straight across the scale and leading off into the desert scrub, exactly where the white Freightliner had been backed up. The tracks were deep, sinking into the concrete dust, indicating a truly immense weight. I didn't need to see the truck again. I knew the moment I passed, the Freightliner had moved. My passing had completed its bureaucratic ritual, triggering the phantom weigh-in and printing the final receipt of its ghost haul. Its duty was complete, its weight documented, and the driver, F. O'Malley, was finally given the order to proceed. I scrambled back to my rig, heart hammering. I drove away from that way station without looking back, leaving the fresh, heavy tracks of the preceding ghost truck to fade in the desert dust. I never fully understood what O'Malley was hauling that was so heavy, or why he was forced to spend 3 decades reliving his way in. But I know that night, I acted as the ghost clerk, and I finally signed off on his paperwork, letting him continue his heavy, silent journey into the deep, dark vastness of the Arizona night. And I wonder, now that he's driving, what the real final destination of 80,000 pounds of unknown cargo truly is. Story 10. The backroads of rural Georgia in the dead of summer possess a humidity that feels less like weather and more like a physical shroud. I was deep in the pine and scrub oak country, running a load late one night, when I realized I'd taken a wrong turn down a narrow, confusing county road. The road was too tight for my rig to safely execute a 3-point turn, and I needed a wide open space fast. Around 1 a.m., I saw an opportunity, a massive, open field behind a line of trees, marked by a faded sign that read, "Overflow Storage Area." It looked like a derelict, lay-down yard, the asphalt cracked and grass-choked, but it was enormous. I pulled off the road and cut my lights, letting the truck roll quietly onto the cracked pavement. The night was hot and exceptionally still, the air thick with the smell of dry grass and stagnant water. I killed the engine, and the silence was total, broken only by the distant, high-pitched whine of cicadas. I figured I could pull a wide circle and be back on the main road in 10 minutes. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. Right in the center of the vast, empty field, there was a single, massive refrigerator trailer. It was a long, white metal box, gleaming faintly in the moonlight, unhitched and standing on its heavy landing gear. There was no tractor unit anywhere in sight, and the field was otherwise empty. It was strange to see such a large piece of equipment abandoned in the middle of nowhere, but my focus was on turning. I got out of the cab to survey the best path, my boots crunching on the loose gravel. That's when I heard the sound. It was a faint, metallic noise coming from the center of the field, right where the trailer sat. A low, rhythmic clink, clink, clink. I stopped walking and listened. It was unmistakably metal hitting metal, but it wasn't the sound of settling or cooling. It was too consistent, too deliberate. I walked cautiously toward the trailer, flashlight in hand. The sound grew slightly louder as I approached, a chillingly regular pulse in the profound silence. I approached the front of the trailer, shining my beam over the landing gear and the area where the tractor unit should have been. The sound was definitely coming from the fifth wheel, the massive curved plate of steel where the truck would connect. It was empty, completely bare. Yet, the rhythmic clink, clink, clink persisted. I leaned in, holding the light steady. It sounded exactly like the coupling mechanism was being slowly, tentatively agitated, as if a ghostly truck was backing up, and its fifth wheel plate was nudging the trailer's kingpin over and over again, searching for the connection. It was the sound of a very careful, very patient driver trying to hook up. I circled the fifth wheel, trying to find a broken spring or a loose chain that could be swaying in some phantom breeze, but everything was static and heavy. The sound wasn't random. It possessed an unnerving rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. A slow, measured clink. Wait, Clink, wait, clink. I knew then it wasn't mechanical. Something invisible was moving the coupling plate, and as the realization set in, the sound abruptly changed. The slow, tentative clink stopped. The noise that replaced it was faster, more violent, and possessed a desperate, aggressive energy. It became a frantic, rapid clink-rattle-clatter, as if the unseen force had lost its patience and was slamming the two metallic surfaces together in a furious attempt to secure the connection. And with this change in rhythm came a new sound, one that froze the blood in my veins. It was a low, sibilant hiss, a sound like air escaping under immense pressure, coming from the dark, open space directly beneath the trailer's neck. It wasn't the sound of an air brake leak. It was guttural, dry, and seemed to vibrate with pure rage. It sounded like frustration, profound and angry, directed entirely at the fact that the connection could not be made. I dropped to a crouch, shining my flashlight underneath the belly of the trailer, the frantic clatter hammering above my head. The space was dark, greasy, and empty, but the sound of the hissing and the violent metallic thrashing was loudest right there. It was emanating from the space directly surrounding the kingpin, the part of the trailer that locks into the fifth wheel. I realized with sickening certainty that whatever was trying to connect to the trailer wasn't trying to drive it away. It was trying to secure it. It was trying to trap the cargo, or maybe trap the next person who came close enough to the coupling point. The focus of the violence was the connection itself. The clatter was the sound of something fighting with the mechanics of the coupling, not to drive, but to lock down. The feeling radiating from the empty hitch was one of cold, focused malice. It was a desire to possess, to enclose. I felt an intense, suffocating pressure, as if the air were being violently compressed around the open kingpin. Then, the hissing intensified, becoming a sharp, high-pitched screech that grated on my ears, and the clattering reached a fever pitch, an almost continuous blur of sound. It was the sound of something reaching the height of its mechanical fury. I scrambled backward, crawling away from the belly of the trailer, abandoning the flashlight where it lay. I got to my feet and ran, sprinting blindly across the cracked asphalt toward the safety of my own rig. The sound of the frantic, frustrated coupling slammed against my back, a chorus of metallic violence and dry, angry air. I threw myself into the cab, locked the door, and didn't even bother to turn around. I simply started the engine, threw it into gear, and drove out of that field as fast as my wheels could turn. As I sped past the derelict trailer, I risked a final glance in my side mirror. The white metal box was visible, reflecting the moonlight. The furious clattering had stopped the instant my engine roared to life. Everything was silent again, but as my truck moved away, I saw a faint, dark smudge near the ground, right under the trailer's front end, where the fifth wheel sat. The smudge was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to creep out from beneath the trailer, moving not toward me, but toward the perimeter of the field, as if its anchor point had been disrupted by my presence, and it was now seeking a new hiding place. I never found out what was inside that refrigerated trailer, or why an unseen force was desperately trying to couple with it. But I knew that whatever was rattling that hitch was primal, territorial, and was trying to create an insurmountable seal, a finality of connection. The fear that haunts me isn't the thought of meeting a ghost, but the knowledge that some things are not looking to be free. They're looking to be permanently trapped, and they get violently angry when their locking mechanism fails. And I had stumbled right into the coupling point of a decades-long, silent struggle for containment in the heart of that dark Georgia field. Story 11. The Appalachians in late autumn, especially the stretch through the western North Carolina hills, have a specific kind of damp, suffocating fog that feels less like weather and more like a substance poured over the mountains. I was running a secondary route, hauling construction material up toward Boone, trying to avoid the heavy interstate traffic. The road was narrow, winding, and completely deserted around 2 a.m. The air was so thick and heavy that my own headlights seemed to just diffuse into the white curtain, and the silence was deep, punctuated only by the low growl of my engine laboring up the grades. I was pushing through a particularly dense patch of fog when I saw the break in the tree line. It was an old, overgrown logging access road, and tucked deep within the dense shadows, half hidden by thick, invasive kudzu vines, was a truck. It was an old, beat-up gravel hauler, a heavy-duty dump truck from the late 70s or early 80s. It was covered in a deep, ruddy rust, the paint peeling away like sunburnt skin. The massive tires were flat, sunk into the damp earth, and the dump bed was half full of solidified, moss-covered gravel. It looked like it had been sitting there, rotting, since the last logging boom crashed decades ago. I slowed down my rig, curiosity overriding the fear of the dark. You don't often see a machine of that size simply abandoned. They're usually salvaged. I pulled onto the shoulder, maybe 50 feet away, and cut my lights, letting my own engine settle down to an idle before finally shutting it off. The resulting silence was instant, profound, and heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. I stared at the relic through the thick, swirling fog. The front cab was squat and boxy, its massive windshield opaque with grime and condensation. I was just about to tell myself to leave it alone when the truck moved. Not the whole truck, but the windshield wipers. They suddenly lurched to life. The motor didn't hum or whine. There was no engine sound, no flash of electrical light. Just the slow, agonizing, involuntary movement of the two rusted metal blades. They moved with a painful stiffness, squeaking loudly against the dry, dirty glass, a harsh, abrasive sound that cut through the silence like a physical wound. The movement was slow, deliberate, and deeply unnerving. The blade on the driver's side performed a single, stiff, half-arc swipe, dragging the dried dust into an uneven streak before stopping abruptly halfway up the glass, frozen in the mist. My heart hammered against my ribs. The truck was dead, cold, and rusted into the earth. There was no way the electrical system could fire those wipers. I told myself it was the cold, some final, slow release of tension in a forgotten coil, but the movement was too fluid, too purposeful. I watched, mesmerized by a terror so profound it felt paralyzing. After a tense pause that felt like minutes, the blades moved again. This time, it was the upper blade, the one frozen halfway up the windshield that slowly, agonizingly completed its arc, scraping loudly all the way down to the bottom rest position. Squeak, scrape. Then it too stopped instantly. The silence that followed was terrifying. The wipers were now both resting at the bottom of the windshield, exactly where they should be. But I knew the process wasn't finished. I was watching an isolated, desperate act being repeated by a ghost. And then it started again. The bottom blade slowly, painfully, dragged itself through a half arc, stopping halfway up. Squeak. Pause. Then the upper blade completed the motion, dragging back down to the bottom. Scrape. Pause. It was a slow, deliberate, agonizing routine. It wasn't wiping the windshield. It was a rhythmic, futile gesture against the perpetual darkness and fog. It was the movement of a man trying to clear his vision desperately, one last time, before whatever was out there finally blocked the view forever. I grabbed my flashlight and shined a beam at the cab. The light cut through the fog, illuminating the interior. The cab was empty. The steering wheel was gone, the seat was shredded, and the dashboard was a mess of broken dials. There was no key in the ignition, and the engine bay was a gaping hole of rust. But as my light swept across the dashboard, I noticed something strange in the glass right where the wipers were moving. The path the blade was dragging through the grime was not the shape of the rubber blade itself, but a wider, more deliberate smear. It was as if something was moving the whole arm in a forced motion against its own resistance. I watched the movement again, focusing on the hinges. As the driver's side blade lurched upward, I saw a faint, momentary shadow of movement behind the glass, near the top of the dashboard. A slight, fleeting distortion in the reflection of my flashlight beam, as if something large and indistinct was briefly pushed against the inside of the glass to assist the arc. The terrifying conclusion solidified in my mind. The electrical system wasn't moving the wipers. Something was inside the cab, pushing the wiper arms, performing the action with a mechanical slowness that spoke of immense effort or perhaps profound fatigue. I shouted, my voice sounding weak and thin in the heavy air. "Who's in there? Stop that." The wipers stopped instantly, frozen at the bottom rest position. The silence was immediate and thick. I waited, heart pounding, listening for a cough, a footstep, anything to explain the impossible. Instead, I heard a sound from inside the abandoned cab, coming from the speaker grill on the ruined dash. It was low, dry, and strained, a whispered imitation of the sound the wipers had just made. Squeak, pause, scrape. It wasn't the actual wipers. It was a vocal mimicry, a chilling, mocking echo of the movement I had just witnessed, delivered in a sound so close and dry it felt like something scraping the back of my own throat. It was as if the entity inside the truck was acknowledging my demand, but then choosing to repeat the sound just to let me know it heard me and didn't care. I backed away, stumbling on the uneven shoulder, never taking my eyes off the cab. I had to get away from that sound, from that forced, agonizing ritual. I knew that the driver hadn't been saved. He had been trapped, forced to spend his final moments in a futile attempt to wipe the darkness away, and whatever had trapped him was now stuck in the same loop, performing the final, desperate gesture for anyone foolish enough to stop and watch. I got back into my rig, started the engine, and pulled out onto the road without looking in the rearview mirror. I drove hard, pushing through the thick, swirling fog. After about 10 minutes, the fog finally broke, revealing the clear, cold black of the mountain night sky. I glanced in my mirror. The road was empty. But for the rest of that night, every time I had to use my own windshield wipers to clear the condensation, I heard a sound underneath the familiar thump-thump of the blades, a phantom, high-pitched squeak, scrape that I knew wasn't coming from my own truck. It was the sound of the dead hauler's wipers, still moving, still struggling, forever trapped in that single, agonizing arc, deep in the heavy, breathing silence of the Appalachian woods. Story 12. The New Mexico desert is a place of profound, unsettling stillness once the brutal sun finally gives up. I was running a long, lonely haul across the remote western stretches, the sky a deep, bruised purple-black after a spectacular sunset. I pulled into a wide, dusty turnout. Less a rest stop and more a place where the asphalt just gave way to packed earth, intending to catch a few hours sleep before the day's heat started up again. As my headlights swept the clearing, I saw the other truck. It was an old flatbed rig, a long-nosed conventional from the late 60s, angled awkwardly against a low rock formation. It was a museum piece, completely derelict. The chrome was tarnished, the paint was faded down to the primer, and the tires were cracked and flat. It looked like it had been sitting there for 30 years, slowly dissolving into the arid landscape. I parked my own rig a respectful distance away and shut down the engine. The resulting silence was total, dry, and immediately oppressive. After hours of driving, I needed to stretch my legs and shake off the road hypnosis. I grabbed my mag light and started walking toward the derelict flatbed, morbid curiosity pulling me forward. The closer I got, the more apparent the decay became. The cab was heavily pitted, and the load on the flatbed, a shapeless mass covered by a faded green tarp, was sunk into the rusted frame. The driver's side window was completely shattered, leaving a jagged, dark hole. The interior was exposed to the elements, visible under the harsh beam of my flashlight. I peered through the broken window. The cab was a ruin of sun-baked vinyl and shredded foam. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform layer of reddish desert dust. It looked like a tomb that had been violently disturbed. But then I saw it. Neatly centered on the dashboard, just above the steering column, was a small, white plastic clamshell container. And inside the container was a sandwich. It was utterly pristine. A simple turkey and cheese on white bread, sliced diagonally, exactly the way you'd buy it from a roadside deli. There was no mold, no decay, no shriveling, and, astonishingly, no dust on the plastic lid. It looked like it had been purchased and placed there that afternoon. It was the only thing in the entire cab that was not ruined by time and the elements. The sight was utterly jarring, a perfect piece of domestic life, frozen in a setting of complete decay. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I reached out a tentative hand toward the broken window, but hesitated, realizing the significance of what I was seeing. It wasn't just a sandwich. It was the physical manifestation of the exact moment the driver's life had been interrupted. It was his last meal, untouched, preserved by some impossible force. As I stood there, flashlight beamed steady, trying to reconcile the 30 years of dust with the fresh, clean white bread, a large, black desert fly buzzed lazily into the open window space. It circled the clamshell container twice, landed briefly on the plastic lid, and then, with a strange, sudden intensity, it rocketed away, not flying off naturally, but moving with the frantic, startled speed of an insect that had just been warned off. I leaned in closer, my ear near the broken glass, ignoring the jagged edges. The dry, warm desert air was all around me, but right next to the sandwich, there was a profound, localized drop in temperature. I could feel it distinctly. The air around the clamshell container was noticeably cooler, almost refrigerated, a small, perfectly preserved bubble of coldness in the middle of the desert night. It wasn't a mechanical preservation. It was an energetic one. The moment of interruption, the driver's last intention, to eat this sandwich, was being held in a temporal loop. And whatever had caused the interruption was still there, guarding the meal. I reached my hand through the shattered window, determined to touch the container, to break the spell. But as my fingers moved into the field of cold air surrounding the sandwich, I heard a sound. It was faint, dry, and low, a sound that seemed to come from the darkest corners of the empty cab, right at the base of the driver's seat. It was a soft, rhythmic chewing sound. It was slow, labored, and utterly impossible. The sound of someone masticating something dry and tough, but doing so without energy, without pleasure. It wasn't the sound of the preserved sandwich being eaten. It was the sound of something else chewing, silently, endlessly, right there in the dark, empty cab. I froze, pulling my hand back instantly. My flashlight beam darted to the dark floorboards and the black, torn vinyl of the driver's seat. I saw nothing but dust and decay. Yet, the dry, rhythmic crunch chew continued, impossibly close, emanating from the very spot where the missing driver's body should have been. I took a slow, agonizing step back, realizing the terrifying implication. The sandwich wasn't untouched because it was waiting for the driver to return. It was untouched because the driver was still there, or what was left of him was still there, and it was eating something else, something I couldn't see, something that required endless, slow mastication in the dark. The chewing intensified slightly, becoming wetter, heavier, and then a single, soft, moist smack sound came from the darkness beneath the dash. It was a noise of satisfaction, quickly suppressed. I raised my flashlight again, aiming it through the shattered hole and into the cab's interior. As the light hit the dashboard, the pristine sandwich container shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I registered the subtle movement. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tilt, as if something invisible had just bumped the back of the plastic. Then, from the spot where the chewing sound had been, a whisper emerged. It was dry, rattling, and sounded like the desert wind dragging across sandpaper. "Not for you." The voice was possessive, final, and directed entirely at my intrusion. It confirmed everything. The sandwich was a boundary marker, a trophy, and the thing that had interrupted the driver was now guarding the spoils, perpetually feasting on whatever it had taken from the man, while his last earthly intention, that simple turkey and cheese, remained pristine, preserved by the cold, possessive energy of the unseen occupant. I didn't wait to see what it was eating. I stumbled backward, turning and running back across the dusty clearing to my own rig. I threw myself into the cab, locked the doors, and drove out of that turnout without looking in the rearview mirror, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I drove until the sun finally clawed its way over the horizon. I never reported the truck. I didn't want to bring anyone else to that terrible, quiet place. But for years afterward, every time I stopped for a break, I would find myself checking my own dashboard, just to be sure there was nothing there, nothing clean, nothing untouched, nothing waiting for me to be interrupted. And sometimes, when I'm alone and the engine is off in the deep silence of the night, I can still hear the phantom sound, faint and dry, of something slow, rhythmic, and endlessly chewing in the darkness. Story 13. The deep timber country of Washington State is a relentless place. Once you leave the main arteries, the logging roads narrow to single tracks, hemmed in by towering Douglas firs that block out the sun, even at midday. In late October, the air is perpetually cold, thick with moisture and the smell of pine mulch and damp earth. I was running a special delivery, hauling emergency generators over one of these seldom-used routes, Forest Road 48, a narrow ribbon of asphalt that hadn't seen maintenance in years. I'd been driving for 18 hours straight, and the loneliness of the road was starting to wear on me. Around 4 a.m., I came around a blind curve and had to slam on my brakes. Right in the middle of a small, muddy turnout, there was another rig. It wasn't a wreck, but it was certainly abandoned. It was a massive lowboy trailer, the kind used for heavy equipment, sitting low and wide on its suspension. The tractor unit, however, was gone. It had been completely stripped, leaving only the fifth wheel plate and a few sheared air hoses. But the trailer itself was still loaded. Squatting on the low deck was a piece of heavy construction equipment, an old, massive bulldozer. It was rusted to a deep, ruddy orange, covered in moss and solidified mud. It was angled slightly, its massive steel tracks resting on the wooden decking. It looked like a derelict giant, left to rot in the cold, wet air. I pulled my own rig onto the shoulder and shut off the engine, needing to get out and stretch. My professional curiosity, mixed with the dread of the deep woods, compelled me to check the scene. You don't abandon a load like that. It's too valuable. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out. The air was bone-chillingly cold, and the silence was immediate and profound. I walked toward the back of the lowboy. The first thing I noticed was the chains. They were massive, thick links, specialized grade 100 chains, wrapped tight over the bulldozer's chassis and secured to the trailer with huge, heavy-duty tension binders. The chains looked new, or at least well-maintained, cinched down with a tension that clearly meant business. The load was secured perfectly, immobilized. I ran my hand over the nearest chain, checking the tension. It was solid, taut as a piano wire. But as I crouched there, my hand resting on the icy metal link, I heard it. It was a deep, grating scrape, a resonant SSCCHRRNKKK. The sound came from the trailer bed, right beneath the massive, rusted tracks of the bulldozer. It was the sound of heavy metal moving on heavy metal. Simultaneously, the chain under my hand went suddenly, violently taut, pulling my fingertips away with a jolt. The entire load, the colossal 20-ton bulldozer, shifted. It moved maybe an inch, no more, scraping against a trailer deck with that terrifying groan, and then settled again with a bone-jarring thump. I sprang back, scrambling away from the trailer, shining my flashlight beam frantically at the dozer. There was no wind, no earthquake, no vibration from the ground. The trees surrounding us were still. The movement was entirely internal, generated by the load itself. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to rationalize it as a mechanical shift due to temperature change, or maybe the decking finally giving way. But the deliberate, powerful tightening of the chain under my hand felt too purposeful, too strong to be simple physics. I watched, terrified, as the dozer shifted again. The massive, rusty machine groaned, a deep, resonant sound like a giant sigh, and its tracks ground against the wood. The whole machine moved another half-inch, not violently, but with a slow, silent, supernaturally heavy effort, settling again with a sickening, final clank. The chains didn't give, they simply went taut, bearing the impossible stress. It was a deliberate movement. The bulldozer was moving itself, fighting the bonds that secured it. I backed up further, keeping the flashlight beam locked on the monstrosity. I could now see the tension binders, the metal ratchets used to tighten the chains, were vibrating faintly, humming under the internal, self-generated stress of the shifting load. The movement intensified. This time, it wasn't a shift, it was a rhythmic, subtle heave. The massive engine block of the dozer tilted slightly, then returned, then tilted again, scraping the deck beneath it. Huh. Huh. It was the sound of a great, terrible weight trying to rise up, trying to escape its constraints, not with fire or noise, but with deep, silent, raw physical effort. It was struggling to live. As I watched, horrified, a loose piece of scrap metal, a fender perhaps, that was resting near the dozer's massive track, slowly slid off the deck and dropped to the ground. It was pushed off by the subtle, rhythmic pressure of the shifting steel track as the machine flexed against its bonds. I suddenly imagined the missing driver. He hadn't just secured a heavy piece of machinery. He had secured something that had been patiently waiting for its chance to escape. He hadn't run out of fuel or broken down. He had realized, too late, what he was hauling, and he had stripped his cab and fled, abandoning the load, but leaving the chains cinched down with every ounce of strength he had, knowing that only sheer, heavy metal could hold the thing. The shifting intensified, becoming a continuous, scraping drone. The chains were beginning to hum loudly now, sounding like deep, plucked bass strings under the incredible tension. Then, from the massive, gaping hole of the dozer's engine bay, I heard a new sound. It was low, dry, and resonant, a sound that seemed to be traveling up from the core of the earth and out of the rusted machine. It was a moan, not a human scream, but a deep, guttural, despairing moan that resonated with metal and rock, a sound of profound frustration. The sound of something impossibly heavy that was so close to freedom, but utterly defeated by the thick steel links. I turned and bolted, running back to my own truck with a frantic, desperate energy. I threw myself into the cab, not stopping to secure the door until I was behind the wheel. The grinding, metallic drone of the bulldozer shifting on the lowboy was the last sound I heard before I started my engine. I pulled out onto the narrow logging road, flooring the accelerator. In my side mirror, the last thing I saw was the immense dark hulk of the lowboy and its terrifying cargo. And then, through the dense fog in my own dust cloud, I saw the reflection of the massive, rusted bulldozer move. It gave one final, violent heave, and I saw the chains momentarily flash as they took the full force of the movement. I drove out of those woods and didn't stop until the sun was high and the trees were gone. I never reported the abandoned lowboy. I couldn't. How do you explain to a trooper that you encountered a massive construction machine that was moving itself, inch by inch, straining against its chains and sighing with the despair of a trapped beast? I left it there, eternally chained, struggling against its bonds. And I sometimes wonder if that thing, whatever silent, terrible weight was embodied in that rusty steel, ever managed to scrape its way free and roll off that deck, finally disappearing into the dark, relentless wilderness that was clearly waiting for it. Story 14. The stretch of highway through the higher passes of the Rockies, especially on the secondary routes, is a place that feels utterly divorced from the modern world. In mid-September, the air is thin and cold, carrying the sharp scent of pine and granite. I was pushing a late run, hauling a load of dry goods east, completely alone on the black, winding asphalt. The night was brilliantly clear, the stars so sharp they hurt your eyes, but the isolation was intense, emphasizing the vast, empty space around my rig. I was fighting the fatigue that comes with the early morning hours, around 3:30 a.m., when I spotted a wide, gravel-strewn emergency parking lane. I pulled over, needing just 15 minutes to reset my eyes. As I slowed, my headlights swept the lane and fell upon another truck parked maybe 100 yards ahead of me. It was a classic, long-nosed Peterbilt, the kind with the massive hood and endless rows of running lights. It was dead still, lights out, but its chrome wheels and large fuel tanks caught the ambient moonlight, gleaming faintly, a stark, metallic presence against the black wall of the mountain forest. I came to a stop, set the brakes, and was just reaching for my travel mug when I glanced into my passenger side mirror, the large convex glass that give you a view of your blind spot and the entire side of your trailer. The scene was familiar, the side of my white trailer, the empty road behind me, and the dark slope of the mountain. But the Peterbilt wasn't there. It should have been a massive, unmistakable reflection, a hulking shape dominating the forward edge of the mirror. I knew exactly where it was parked, yet the mirror showed only the empty stretch of gravel lane and the faint outline of the road receding into the distance. It was as if the 100-yard between my truck and the Peterbilt were a solid, unreflective wall. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to find a distortion or a trick of the light. Nothing. The reflection was perfectly clear, perfectly normal, but the object I knew to be physically present in front of me was completely absent from the mirrored reality. A cold, heavy knot formed in my chest. I stared at the Peterbilt through my actual windshield. It was right there, solid, real, and still. I looked back at the mirror. Empty. This wasn't just a trick of the eyes. It was impossible. The laws of optics, the simple physics of reflection, were being violated. I shut off the engine, the silence that followed feeling immediate and dangerous. I grabbed my powerful maglite, determined to prove my eyes were deceiving me. I stepped out onto the cold, thin air of the mountain. Every crunch of my boots on the gravel sounded deafening. I walked slowly toward the Peterbilt, watching the huge, chrome fuel tanks gleaming faintly under the moonlight. As I got closer, the truck became even more imposing, a hulking, silent presence. The cab was pitch black, the curtains drawn tight across the rear window. I stopped directly at the driver's side door. The truck's own oversized side mirror was mounted on a massive chrome arm. I shined my light on it. The glass was perfectly intact, surprisingly clean, without the dust and road grime that should have coated an abandoned rig. I stepped directly in front of the mirror, expecting to see my own reflection, the bulky shape of my jacket, the beam of my flashlight. Instead, I saw a profound, chilling emptiness. The mirror was reflecting only the scene behind the Peterbilt. The long, empty stretch of the emergency lane, the faint outline of the black asphalt highway, and the distant, dark shape of my own truck parked far down the road. It was a perfect, seamless image of the past, of a road that was momentarily clear. But my figure, the shape of a 6-foot-tall man standing a foot away from the glass in the present moment, was completely absent. I waved my hand directly in front of the mirror, and the reflection did not ripple, did not blur, did not change. It was an image of a moment that had passed, a view the driver had seen before he stopped, and everything in the current reality, including me, was simply being overwritten. The coldness I had felt in the air intensified, washing over me in a sudden, sharp wave. It felt less like temperature and more like a temporal chill. This truck wasn't just abandoned. It was caught in a deep, isolated loop, a moment that was being eternally revisited, and to the truck and its internal reality, the present, the last 30 years, perhaps, simply did not exist. I was standing in a field of reality that the truck could not register. I leaned in closer to the mirror, my breath fogging the glass right at the edge of the reflective surface. I could see the pristine reflection of the empty road behind the truck, and I knew that if the original driver was still in the cab, checking his mirrors, he would see only that clear, empty road, completely oblivious to my presence. The terrifying realization hit me. If this truck existed only in the past, and I was invisible to its reality, then the driver might also be invisible to mine. I could be standing right next to his ghostly form, or he could be sitting silently inside the cab, and I would never know it, because he belongs to the unreflective reality that the mirrors only bypass. As I backed away from the mirror, slowly, carefully, my eyes fixed on the empty glass, the darkness inside the cab seemed to deepen. I looked away from the mirror and up at the driver's side window. The glass was dark, but I thought I saw a slight movement in the deep blackness, a faint displacement of shadow, too subtle to be certain. Then, from inside the cab, I heard a sound. It was the low, sharp, mechanical sound of an air release valve, a quick PSSH, the sound a driver makes when he adjusts the seat or engages the air brakes before pulling out. It was a sound of preparation, of getting ready to move. I scrambled away from the truck, turning and running back toward my own rig. The idea of that huge, silent truck, driven by an invisible occupant who was preparing to pull out onto the highway without being able to see me, or anything in the present, was too much to bear. I threw myself into my cab, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway, flooring the accelerator. I didn't dare look into my side mirror again. I just kept driving, speeding down the empty road. After 5 miles, I slowed down and finally forced myself to check the passenger side mirror. The reflection was normal, the clear highway stretching out behind me, the dark slopes of the mountain. The space was empty. The Peterbilt was gone. But as the road curved and my lights swung wide, I caught a brief, final glimpse of something unsettling. Just at the very edge of the mirror's view, where the light faded to black, there was a faint horizontal streak of light, a bright, unnaturally sharp chrome reflection, moving quickly, keeping pace with my truck, but located where a vehicle in the present day simply couldn't be. I didn't slow down again. I drove until the sun broke over the eastern plains, turning the black mountains into familiar, solid shapes. I know what I saw. That truck wasn't a danger to the past, but it was a terrifying violation of the present. I was briefly inserted into a time loop where I was the ghost, invisible and unheard, witnessing the last, silent act of a trucker still preparing to move. And I know that somewhere on those dark, lonely stretches of highway, that silent Peterbilt is still parked, its mirrors reflecting only the empty road, perpetually waiting for the moment its long-gone driver gives the signal to finally proceed. And when it does, it will move into the present without being able to see anything that is actually there. Story 15. The plains of Kansas in late October are a place of endless, chilling wind and profound, empty silence. I was running a long haul, pushing through the night on a county road that sliced straight through miles of stubbled cornfields. The sky was immense and black, and the isolation was total. I was exhausted and needed a 20-minute break from the hypnotic straightness of the road. I pulled off onto a wide, muddy field access track, the kind of pull-off used by farm equipment during harvest season. As my headlights swung, they illuminated a forgotten monument to rural decay, an old livestock hauler, a massive rig with the trailer long gone, the cab-over unit stripped down to a rusted skeleton and left for dead. It sat tilted awkwardly on flat tires, half sunk into the brown mud. I killed the engine, and the sudden stillness was jarring. I grabbed my thermos and got out, walking a few steps toward the relic, drawn by the eerie silence radiating from it. It was a classic piece of junk, the metal pitted and the paint faded to a chalky white. The driver's side door was locked, the glass intact, but the passenger side window was completely missing, just a dark, rectangular hole exposing the interior to the wind. I walked around the hood and climbed up onto the rusted passenger running board, leaning in to shine my heavy flashlight into the cab. The interior was a desolate mess, faded upholstery, years of dust and mud packed onto the floor, and a lingering scent of old diesel and something vaguely animal, likely residue from the missing trailer. But as my light swept the dash, I saw an anomaly. Right on the passenger side, sitting squarely on top of the glove compartment door, was a small, folded piece of paper. It looked like a standard roadside diner receipt, folded in half neatly, but it was remarkably white, completely free of the grime that coated everything else. It was crisp, and in the beam of my light, it cast a distinct, sharp shadow. The sheer impossibility of the paper's condition, untouched by years of wind, moisture, and dust, made my skin crawl. It was placed there intentionally, recently, or perhaps eternally. I reached my hand through the missing window, intending to grab the receipt. My fingers brushed the cold, sharp edge of the shattered glass frame and stretched toward the paper, which was only about 12 inches away. But I couldn't reach it. My fingertips felt like they were getting closer, but they weren't. The distance felt elastic, warped. It was like reaching into a funhouse mirror. I tried to stretch further, contorting my body, but the paper remained just out of reach, hovering beyond the absolute limit of my extension. It was only a foot away, yet it felt like yards. I pulled back, heart hammering, my mind racing for a rational explanation. Maybe the angle was deceptive, or my arm was simply shorter than I thought. I found a long, plastic ruler I kept in my glove box and climbed back onto the running board. I inserted the ruler through the opening, lining up the tip with the folded paper. I pushed the ruler forward, watching the reflection of the plastic blade slide across the dusty dashboard. The ruler's tip reached the paper and passed directly over it. My jaw dropped. The ruler passed right over the top of the folded receipt, completely failing to make contact. It was as if the paper were a two-dimensional image projected onto the dash, yet I could clearly see its depth, the thickness of the folded edge, and its sharp, clear shadow cast by my own flashlight beam. I tried again, pressing down slightly. The ruler simply seemed to dip, passing through the space where the paper was and clatter lightly against the plastic dash beneath. I retracted the ruler, staring at the paper. It was still there, sitting perfectly centered, undisturbed. As I watched, trembling, the paper began to move. Very slowly, deliberately, the folded receipt began to unfold itself, just a tiny bit at a time, each movement an agonizing, silent testament to an unseen presence. It took maybe 30 seconds, but the paper gradually, impossibly, flattened out onto the glove compartment door. Scrawled across the center of the paper, written in thick, dark black ink that looked wet and fresh, was a single word: S-T-A-Y. The letters were thick, blocky, and completely clear in the beam of my flashlight. It was not a plea for help, not a warning of danger, but a blunt, silent command. Stay. The meaning was chillingly clear. The paper was unreachable because the thing that placed it there, the unseen occupant who was still in this cab, still commanding this space, was preventing me from taking its message away. It didn't want the note to be examined or moved. It wanted the note to be read, to be obeyed, and to remain exactly where it was. The space around the word seemed to deepen, the ink looking blacker than any normal ink, sucking the light in. I felt an intense, possessive pressure emanating from the cab, a cold, silent demand that I stop my intrusion and remain where I was. I backed away slowly, never lifting my light from the word. As I stepped off the running board and onto the cold, hard ground, the word on the paper seemed to vibrate faintly, the ink shimmering with that dark, wet intensity. I took another slow step back, and as I did, I heard a faint sound from inside the cab, a low, rhythmic thump coming from the space under the dash, perfectly timed with the heavy wind that had started to pick up outside. Thump, thump, thump. It was like a slow, heavy foot tapping impatiently against the floorboard. I realized I had trespassed, not just on an old truck, but on a space that was actively, powerfully occupied. The command stay was meant for me, a silent, possessive demand from a driver who had long ago ceased to exist, but whose will still controlled the physics of his cab. I turned and ran back to my own rig, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. I fumbled for the keys, heart pounding, convinced that the unseen foot was about to pound on the metal outside my door. I cranked the engine and threw the transmission into gear, spinning my tires in the mud as I pulled back onto the county road. I didn't stop to look back, but as I sped away, I glanced at my rearview mirror. The derelict cab over was a dark shape against the field, but I could still see the sharp, white gleam of the unfolded paper on the dash, catching the reflected light of my own taillights. I drove until the black fields gave way to the pale light of dawn. I never reported the truck or the note. I knew no one would believe the impossible physics of that warped space or the chilling command scrawled in fresh ink on a decades-old relic. But every time I stop now, I meticulously check the area around my truck, afraid that if I linger too long, I will find a piece of paper, perfectly clean, waiting for me on my own dashboard, commanding me to stay in the silent, possessive grip of the open road. Story 16. The Green Mountains of Vermont, deep in hollows and forgotten logging paths, can be a world of their own. The air hangs perpetually damp and cold, heavy with the scent of pine needles and wet granite. I was running a delivery far off the main highway, navigating a maze of old service roads that were barely paved. It was late autumn, the trees stripped bare, leaving the landscape looking stark and exposed, which only amplified the feeling of being watched. I was driving past a massive, abandoned quarry, a huge, dark gash in the hillside surrounded by steep, densely forested slopes. The place felt fundamentally wrong, utterly quiet and unsettling, like a wound that hadn't healed properly. I needed to pull over to check my route on a paper map, as my GPS had given up an hour ago. I found a small, rough pull-off near the edge of the quarry property, a spot where the gravel dissolved into mud. As my headlights cut the darkness, they caught the shape of another truck sitting maybe 50 yards down a slight, grassy slope. It was an old, heavy-duty dump truck, the kind used for hauling rock and aggregate. It was completely rusted, the kind of deep, flaky orange that spoke of years of weathering, and it was angled awkwardly, as if it had been intentionally driven off the main path and just left to die. I pulled up and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and profound, swallowed by the steep, dark woods. The only sound was the far-off, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the quarry face. My curiosity and the unsettling stillness of the machine compelled me to investigate. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out into the cold air. I walked slowly toward the derelict dump truck. As I got closer, I saw that the driver's side door was wide open, hanging loose on its rusted hinges, exposing the dark interior to the elements. This struck me as odd. Even abandoned vehicles usually have their doors shut. I approached the cab cautiously, shining my light inside. The interior was a wreck, full of leaves, dead insects, and hardened mud. The seats were shredded, and the dash was cracked and covered in a thick layer of fine, gray dust. I could smell mildew, oil, and the sharp scent of decay. I swept my light over the floorboards, the dash, and the pedals. That's when I saw it. Right on the brake pedal, the wide, flat metal plate was a distinct, perfectly preserved footprint. It was a heavy, deep print of a work boot, caked with fresh, dark mud. The tread pattern was sharp and clear, the kind of heavy lug pattern you see on a work boot meant for rough terrain. It was resting exactly where a driver's foot would be when the vehicle was stationary. My mind raced. A fresh, muddy footprint on the brake pedal of a truck that had been sitting here, rusting, for years. I immediately dropped my light to the ground outside the cab. The ground was dry, mostly hard-packed dirt and dust. I swept the beam across the area leading up to the truck, looking for tracks for the path of the person who had climbed in. Nothing. The dry ground was pristine, unbroken. There were no footprints leading away from the open door, no tracks leading to it, and certainly no other muddy footprints on the gravel or grass. The only sign of mud was that single, fresh print. I checked the passenger side floorboards, using my light to meticulously scan the debris. Nothing but old dust and rust. The mud print was confined solely to the brake pedal. I leaned in closer to the open door, feeling a knot of icy fear tighten in my stomach. The mud looked dark, almost wet, completely inconsistent with the arid conditions inside the long-abandoned cab. The print looked like it had been placed there minutes ago, a heavy, deliberate press. As I stared at the chillingly clear impression, a faint, rhythmic sound began to emanate from the interior of the cab. It was a low squeak creak, coming directly from the driver's seat. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't the metallic groan of cooling metal. It was the specific sound of old, strained leather or cracked vinyl flexing under pressure. The sound of a very heavy person subtly shifting their weight. Squeak, creak, squeak. My breath hitched. The driver's seat was completely out of my line of sight due to the wide, low dashboard. I could only see the empty footwell and the perfect, muddy print on the brake. But something was sitting there, quietly, rhythmically adjusting its mass in the darkness. I kept the flashlight beam fixed on the footprint, which now seemed to possess a terrible, unsettling stillness. The print was there because the driver never left the controls, and whatever mud he tracked and remained only on the final point of contact, the pedal. The rhythmic creaking from the seat confirmed that the cab was not empty. I whispered, "Who's in the seat?" The creaking stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and full of the awareness that my question had been heard and processed. I didn't move, waiting for a response, a sound, a sign of what was occupying that driver's space. Instead of a voice, I heard a different sound, low and close, coming from the brake pedal itself. A faint, wet slurp. It sounded like mud being slowly, wetly compressed by an even heavier weight. I watched in sickening horror as the perfect edges of the mud-caked footprint began to blur. The print was slowly, deliberately being squashed, pressed flat into the metal by an unseen force. The distinct treads dissolved, the mud spreading slightly across the surface of the brake pedal, turning the perfect, individual print into a generalized, thick, muddy smear. The process was slow, agonizingly visible under my flashlight beam, and completely silent except for that one terrifying, wet slurp. Whatever was sitting in that seat had heard me, and it was showing me that its foot, the one that had left the print, was not only still on the brake, but was now being pressed down with immense, deliberate force. It was making sure the truck stayed exactly where it was. I pulled my light away from the cab and stumbled backward, turning blindly and running back toward the safety of my own rig. The feeling of the cold, heavy, unseen weight in that dump truck was overwhelming. I threw myself into my driver's seat, locked the door, and cranked the ignition. As I spun my tires, trying to get traction on the muddy shoulder, I risked a final glance back. The open door of the old dump truck was still hanging loose, a black maw against the darkness. I didn't see a figure or a shadow, but the intense feeling of being watched, of being held in place by that immense, unseen presence, was palpable. I drove out of the quarry area and onto the main road, never slowing down. I never reported the truck. I knew the truth. That driver had been interrupted, his foot had been pressed to the brake to stop, and then something else had taken his place, using the mud he left behind as a way to let me know that the truck was still occupied, and that its occupant was actively, silently, keeping the vehicle from ever moving again. The footprint never left the cab because the foot that made it never left the pedal, and the dark, wet woods of Vermont had claimed another victim, forcing him to keep a silent, heavy pressure on the brake for all eternity. Story 17. The foothills of the Sierra Nevada are a deceptive wilderness. They look inviting in the day, all dry pine and scrub brush, but at night, the isolation becomes absolute and the air turns thin and bitterly cold. I was running a special delivery, hauling farm equipment up a remote service road, County Route 39, the kind of road where if you break down, you're waiting 24 hours for a tow. I pulled off onto a gravel turnout around 1 a.m., completely exhausted, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke abruptly around 4 a.m., jerked awake by a sound that every long-haul trucker recognizes in his sleep, the sharp, violent hiss of air brakes engaging. It was an abrupt, decisive sound, the kind that signifies a heavy vehicle coming to a hard, fast stop. I sat up in my bunk, disoriented, and looked out the side window. About 50 yards down the gravel track, sitting perfectly straight on the road, was another truck. It was a massive, old, beaten-up grain hauler, the kind with the rounded belly and the faded company logo barely visible on the doors. It was sitting dead still, and its brake lights were on, a sickly, faint red glow that seemed to be struggling against the dark. The initial hiss should have been brief, a sharp TCHH as the air pressure released, followed by the deep, idling rumble of the engine, keeping the pressure up. But the sound I was hearing was wrong. It wasn't a quick TCHH. It was a continuous, labored, drawn-out exhalation. A long, desperate SSSHHHHHHH that went on and on, constant and unwavering. It didn't sound like air being released by a powered compressor. It sounded like air escaping from a vast, ruptured, pressurized vessel that was bleeding out its contents into the cold night. I climbed out of my bunk and pressed my face against the passenger side window, trying to see the cab. The grain hauler was completely dark except for the faint red glow of its brake lights. The sound was unnerving. It was too long, too steady, and far too loud to be a normal bleed. It had the quality of a sigh, a final, despairing sound of mechanical exhaustion. I watched the brake lights. They were not solid red. They were slowly, agonizingly fading. The sickly red glow was diminishing, visibly losing intensity like a dying ember. The light was being drawn out of the bulbs, and as it faded, the hiss continued, steady and relentless. I felt a profound sense of dread. The air brake system relies on a constant, engine-driven source of air pressure. When the engine is off, the air slowly leaks out, but the brakes shouldn't hold on and hiss like that for minutes on end. This was a catastrophic, complete depletion of the system, and the fading lights suggested the entire electrical power source was dying in conjunction with the air pressure. I shouted, my voice swallowed by the hiss. Hey, you okay? Need help? The only reply was the relentless SSSHHHHHHH and the agonizingly slow demise of the red light. I watched, trapped by the terrifying spectacle. The red glow became anemic, then orange, then a faint, barely visible amber, still clinging to life. The continuous hiss was now reaching a lower, hollower pitch, sounding less like air and more like the very structure of the truck collapsing inward. It took maybe 5 minutes in total, but it felt like an hour. Finally, the last vestige of light, a minuscule pinprick of orange, winked out. The grain hauler was plunged into absolute darkness, becoming a black, silent tomb against the mountain backdrop. The continuous SSSHHHHHHHH ceased at the exact same instant the lights failed. The silence that rushed in was thick and final, heavier than the cold air. The truck was dead, completely, utterly drained of life and pressure. I sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the dark hulk, waiting for an engine to start, a cab door to open, a flashlight beam. Nothing. The immense, dead weight of the hauler just sat there. I didn't dare walk down to it. The exhaustion of the last 5 minutes had drained me more than a full day's drive. I pulled the curtain closed and tried, unsuccessfully, to sleep. I woke up with the sunrise, a weak, pale light filtering into the cab. I had to pass the truck to continue my route. I was intensely nervous, but I knew I had to check it. I started my engine, let the air pressure build, and then drove slowly down the gravel track toward the derelict hauler. The truck looked even more menacing in the weak light, massive, rusted, and utterly cold. The driver's door was closed, the windows covered in grime. As I pulled alongside the truck, I leaned over to look down at the ground immediately beneath its massive tandem wheels. The gravel track was dry everywhere else, baked hard by the desert air. But beneath the hauler's entire chassis, particularly around the air tanks and the brake assemblies, the ground was damp. Not wet with oil or fuel, but damp with a heavy, crystalline layer of condensation. It looked like a thick, inexplicable dew had formed, a wide, dark stain on the pale gravel. I pulled my truck to a stop just past the abandoned hauler and got out. I walked back and knelt down, shining my light on the damp patch. The air around it was still noticeably colder. It was not a leak. It was the moisture of the atmosphere itself, condensed and frozen by the rapid, massive drop in pressure and temperature as the air system gave its final, continuous sigh. The truck hadn't just bled air. It had exhaled its very essence into the ground, condensing the despair onto the earth beneath it. I looked at the stain and then up at the cab. The feeling was overwhelming. The truck was a body, and I had witnessed its final death rattle, its long, drawn-out last breath. The continuous hissing hadn't been a malfunction. It was the sound of the entire machine letting go of its life force. I looked closer at the damp stain. Right in the center, where the air tanks were mounted, the condensation was so heavy that the fine dust had clumped into tiny, gray mud balls. And pressed into that damp, mud-like surface were faint, small indentations. Not footprints, but something too numerous and too fine to identify. They looked like the residue of something small and organic that had been briefly disturbed by the catastrophic pressure release, something that was forced out or away during the truck's final, desperate sigh. I didn't touch the truck. I backed away, returned to my own rig, and completed my route. I called the local sheriff's department from the next town, reporting an abandoned vehicle. I told them only that the truck looked old and had flat tires, omitting any mention of the chilling, continuous hiss or the condensing despair on the ground. I learned later that the sheriff's department found a grain hauler, identified it as a missing vehicle from 30 years prior, and confirmed the air brake system was entirely depleted, with a huge crack running along the main reservoir tank. They towed the truck away, never finding a trace of the driver. But I know the truth. The driver didn't abandon the hauler. He was sitting there, his foot on the brake, when the life was somehow sucked out of the machine around him. And I was the sole witness to the truck's long, slow, mechanical passing. A death that was marked by a final, fading red light and a massive, continuous exhalation that left behind a cold, inexplicable dew, a damp grave marker on the dry gravel of the mountain road. Story 18. The plains near the Wyoming border are a place of such brutal emptiness that they feel less like landscape and more like an absence of everything else. It was early November, and the wind was relentless, carrying a fine, stinging grit and a cold that seemed to come from the core of the earth. I was running a load of industrial piping, pushing through the dead of night, desperately needing a place to pull off and wait for the sun. I spotted a sign for an old, closed-down truck stop. It was a relic, probably abandoned since the interstate rerouted 30 years ago. I took the exit, finding a vast, cracked expanse of concrete, the old service building a dark, windowless husk silhouetted against the weak moonlight. The wind howled across the empty space, making the silence feel aggressive. I was about to pull into a spot when my headlights caught another vehicle parked in the far, darkest corner of the lot, nestled against the crumbling foundation of the old diner. It was a classic snub-nose, cab-over rig, the kind where the driver sits directly over the engine, boxy and utilitarian. It looked utterly forlorn, sitting there like it was waiting for a ghost terminal to open its doors. It was covered in years of road grime, but it was sitting perfectly parallel to the parking lines, as if its driver had just gone inside for a cup of coffee and never returned. I pulled up maybe 50 feet away, shutting off my engine and letting the wind and the silence take over. I watched the old rig for a minute, feeling that familiar, unsettling draw of the abandoned. I grabbed my mag light, intending only to take a quick look to satisfy my morbid curiosity before trying to sleep. I walked slowly across the cracked concrete, the wind whipping around my legs. As I approached the passenger side of the cab over, I shined my light through the grime-streaked window. The interior was predictably faded, but right there on the dashboard, lying open, was an old, thick road atlas, its pages yellowed and brittle. The presence of the atlas felt intimate, a direct link to the man who had driven this rig. I leaned in closer, trying to make out the page it was open to. It looked like a regional map of the immediate area. The passenger door was surprisingly intact, but sealed shut by years of disuse. I found the handle pulled hard, and with a soft, grinding shhnk, the seal broke and the door opened a couple of inches. A rush of stale, cold air, smelling faintly of old coffee and mildew, escaped the cab. I pushed the door open wide enough to shine my light directly onto the atlas. The book was open to the map of the Wyoming-Colorado border region, and across the paper, a line had been drawn. It was a thick, dark line drawn with an indelible black marker, leading from a known, marked junction on the map, a major intersection 40 miles south, straight to the location of the truck stop, which was marked by a faded, hand-drawn circle. The line was ruler straight, drawn with perfect, obsessive precision. But the line didn't end at the truck stop. It continued, drawn straight off the printed page, right over the white margin, past the binding, and onto the cab's dashboard itself. The black marker ink was deeply smeared and scratched into the plastic vinyl of the dash, tracing a thick, frantic path that followed the same trajectory. The initial line on the map was deliberate. The final extension on the dash was desperate. I leaned into the cab, tracing the line with my eyes from the initial map coordinate to the final, smeared scratch in the vinyl. The destination wasn't the truck stop. The stop was just a momentary landmark. The line was pointing somewhere else, following the trajectory of the cab over's final parking spot. I followed the smeared, scratched line as it traveled across the dashboard, past the glove compartment, and then, with a terrifying, final certainty, pointed directly toward the passenger door where I was standing. But it didn't stop there. The line continued, its phantom path moving past the door frame, right to the edge of the truck, and then, based on the truck's angle, it led to a point just beyond my own right shoulder, into the absolute, howling darkness of the empty lot. I stood there, paralyzed, my blood turning to ice, realizing the driver hadn't marked his destination. He had marked the final path, the exact, logical trajectory of the thing that drove him out of the main world and into this forgotten corner. And that path ended precisely where I was standing, leading to the unknown space right behind me. As my fears spiked, the temperature in the cab plummeted. A sudden, violent gust of cold air, colder and heavier than the outside wind, blew through the small opening of the cab. It wasn't the natural wind. It was a localized, internal blast. The gust slammed the old road atlas shut with a thick, heavy thwack, the sound echoing terrifyingly in the small space. And then, as the noise died down, I heard it. A faint, dry, scraping sound coming from the dashboard, right where the black marker line was smeared into the vinyl. It was the sound of something thin and hard, like fingernails or a piece of brittle plastic, being dragged across the dash, slowly and deliberately, tracing the final path on the vinyl, emphasizing the line that led to the darkness behind me. SCCRR. SCCRR. It was the driver, or what possessed the driver, confirming the coordinates of his final departure. I bolted backward, tripping over my own feet on the gravel, turning and running blindly away from the truck. I didn't stop until I was safe inside my own cab, the doors locked and the engine roaring to life. I pulled out of that abandoned truck stop at an insane speed. I drove hard for 40 miles until the sun began to bleed over the horizon. I never looked in my mirrors until I was certain the vast, open plains behind me were completely empty. I know the trucker had reached the end of his road, and he had meticulously documented the entire, terrifying journey. The line wasn't a warning. It was a map, a piece of final, chilling evidence left for the next person who would inevitably break the seal and look inside. And the last sound I heard was the mark of the final destination being confirmed, the path leading away from the light and into the silent, howling darkness that was waiting just beyond the truck's rear bumper, precisely where I had stood. Story 19. The Great Smoky Mountains, particularly the back ridges of Tennessee, carry a kind of thick, humid silence at night that presses down on you. It's a silence filled with the static buzz of insect life and the unseen movement of deep woods creatures, a silence that never feels empty, only watchful. I was running a delivery far off the interstates, using a winding, barely maintained state route. I was exhausted, and around midnight, I found a remote, unofficial pull-off, just a wide, gravelly shoulder where logging trucks sometimes staged. I parked my rig, killed the engine, and drew the curtains. The night was pitch black, the surrounding forest a dense, suffocating wall. The immediate silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick of my own cooling engine. I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, and the isolation was too intense. I found myself staring through the small gap in my curtain at the one other object in the clearing, a derelict box truck, parked haphazardly across the muddy lot. It was ancient, a rusted square of metal, faded blue paint peeling off in large sheets. Moss was actively growing on the roof and the seams of the cargo box, testifying to its years of abandonment. I watched it for probably an hour, just the silent, moldering hulk against the black backdrop. Then, around 1 a.m., something happened inside the cab. A dim, sickly yellow light blinked on, deep inside the dashboard. It was the battery indicator light, a small, faint glow that barely cut the darkness. It remained lit for about 2 seconds, and then, as it died, a faint, low sound followed, a sharp, distinct click. The light was gone. The silence returned, save for the insect chorus. I sat up completely in my bunk, adrenaline replacing the fatigue. There was no way that ancient, moss-covered truck had a functioning electrical system, let alone a battery that could power a dashboard light. I rationalized it as a reflection, maybe a passing firefly. But then, about 5 minutes later, it happened again. The dim, sickly yellow indicator blinked on, held for 2 seconds, and then click. The light died. It kept repeating. Every few minutes, that dim, desperate yellow light would flicker on, followed by the faint, final click. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, persistent, and entirely impossible. I focused intensely on the sound. It wasn't the sound of an electrical short or a switch breaking. It was a precise, familiar mechanical action. I finally realized what the sound was. It was the unmistakable sound of an ignition key being turned. Not fully, not with the intention of engaging the starter, but one short, incomplete turn, just enough to engage the initial accessory circuit and briefly illuminate the dashboard indicators, and then letting go. The engine wasn't turning over. There was no hum of the starter, only that futile, repetitive turn of the key, followed by the brief, ghostly appearance of the yellow battery light, and the final click of the key returning to its rest position. The thought sent a profound chill down my spine. The driver was gone, long gone, but the ghost of his desperation to leave that specific, dark spot was stuck, eternally trying to execute the initial command to flee. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to see the source. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of my rig. The cold air hit me, amplifying the insect buzz. I walked slowly toward the derelict box truck, the soles of my boots scraping on the wet gravel. As I neared the driver's side door, the yellow light blinked on again, illuminating the dark, dusty interior for a fraction of a second. I reached the cab and cautiously shined my heavy beam inside the cracked, grime-covered window. The interior was moldy and ruinous, but my light instantly found the source of the movement. There were a set of old keys, just a few brass ones on a heavy, tarnished ring dangling from the ignition tumbler. And as I watched, they swayed gently, settling from the last movement. I pressed my face against the glass. I didn't have to wait long. The faint, sickly yellow light blinked on, and as it did, the key ring itself began to move. Slowly, with an agonizing, visible effort, the keys rotated in the tumbler, turning themselves forward just that short, incomplete arc, causing the click sound that accompanied the light's final, desperate flicker. Then, the keys fell back, swinging slightly on the chain, returning to their inert position. The entire motion was performed by an unseen force, with an air of profound, exhausted defeat. It was the ghost of a driver, forever locked into the moment he tried to leave, unable to fully crank the key, unable to escape the place where the truck had died. I backed up a step, my mind reeling. I had witnessed the mechanical action, isolated and impossible, carried out by nothing. I stood there, watching the keys settle. I wanted to smash the window, reach in and yank the keys out to break the loop, but the cold, possessive terror radiating from the cab held me captive. The light blinked on again. The keys moved, click. I knew that every time those keys turned, the invisible occupant of the cab was reliving the final moment of their panic, their last attempt to get the engine to catch and drive away from whatever fate met them in that remote spot. I waited until the keys completed their futile movement, and then I spoke into the dark, open air of the clearing. "What are you trying to start?" The keys didn't move. The light didn't blink on immediately. The silence stretched, deep and absolute, save for the hum of the mountains. Then, the keys in the ignition began to swing, slowly, rhythmically, back and forth like a pendulum. They didn't turn in the tumbler. They just swung out from the dash, picking up momentum. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was soft, hypnotic, and utterly chilling. It wasn't the sound of desperation anymore. It was the sound of eternal, patient waiting. The ghost had stopped trying to start the truck. It was simply waiting. I backed away, retreating from the rhythmic tick-tock of the swinging keys. I scrambled back to my rig, never taking my eyes off the cab over. I started my engine and pulled out onto the main road. As I sped away, I glanced one final time in my side mirror. The box truck was a dark, silent shape. But even as the distance grew, I caught the faint, rhythmic flicker of light, a tiny, sickly yellow spark in the absolute blackness. The keys were still turning, still clicking, still trying to initiate that final, failed attempt to leave. I drove until the sunrise, knowing I hadn't broken the loop. I had only briefly disturbed the rhythm. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a remote pull-off, I hear a faint metallic click in the deep silence, and I know that somewhere in the dark hollows of the Smoky Mountains, a set of brass keys is eternally turning, fueled by the desperate, exhausted will of a driver forever imprisoned in the moment he tried and failed to escape. Story 20. The Oklahoma plains, once you get off the interstate and onto the secondary state highways, become a study in isolation. It was late spring, the air thick with humidity and the smell of recently tilled soil, but the darkness was absolute. I was running a load through the early morning hours, heading north, fighting the road fatigue that makes your brain start playing tricks on you. I spotted an old, seldom used gravel pit turnout, ringed by scrub oak and broken asphalt. It was the kind of desolate place truckers use when they need complete silence. I pulled off and killed my engine, letting the pressurized air hiss out of the brakes. The immediate silence was profound, but then I noticed a sound. A deep, continuous mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. It wasn't my rig. It was coming from the far side of the turnout. I got out of my cab, grabbing my heavy coat against the sudden drop in temperature. I walked across the coarse gravel and saw the source of the noise, a refrigerated trailer. It was nearly new, bright white and clean, unhitched and sitting alone, angled slightly toward the dense tree. The large refrigeration unit mounted on the front was running, its diesel engine emitting that deep, heavy, continuous drone. It was strange to see such a clean, expensive piece of equipment parked and abandoned in this remote, forgotten spot. But it was the sound and the feeling of the noise that unsettled me. Reefer units hum. That's just how they are. But this one felt wrong. Too loud, too low, too resonant, like a bass drum being struck rhythmically inside a closed space. The entire machine felt strained, laboring to hold a precise temperature. I walked up to the side of the trailer and put my hand on the bright, white metal skin. The wall was vibrating violently, almost painfully. The deep, heavy drone was transferring right through the skin of the trailer into my hand. It was running full blast, clearly trying to hold an extreme low temperature. But as I looked down, I noticed the landing gear, the metal legs holding the trailer up since it was unhitched. They were barely compressed. The weight plates were resting on the ground, but they weren't sunk in deep, not like a fully loaded refrigerated unit should be. That trailer, by all appearances, was nearly empty. If it was empty, why was the refrigeration unit running so violently, vibrating with such intensity? Why was it struggling to keep an empty volume cold? My professional curiosity turned into a cold, specific dread. I walked to the back of the trailer, my boots crunching on the gravel. The rear doors were secured by a heavy steel latch bar. I reached out, expecting the bar to be locked, secure with a massive padlock. But as I pulled on the latch handle, the entire bar, which should have been securely locked and immobile, lifted right off its fittings with a faint, oily squeak. The doors weren't locked. My heart pounded against my ribs. No trucker leaves a running reefer, especially a clean one, unlocked in a remote area. I pulled the heavy handle and slowly, hesitantly, swung the two massive rear doors open. A burst of cold, dense air rushed out, swirling around my legs. It smelled of ozone and industrial cold, the clean, sterile scent of deep freezing. I shined my flashlight beam inside. The trailer was completely, absolutely empty. Floor to ceiling, side to side, nothing. Just the bright, sterile metal walls and the grooved aluminum floor. The emptiness was startling. I stood there for a moment, letting my mind catch up. An empty trailer running full blast in the middle of nowhere, vibrating with impossible intensity. And as the initial burst of cold air escaped and hit the warm outside air, the drone of the reefer unit changed pitch. It grew suddenly, piercingly louder, shifting from a low drone to a high, strained whine, like an animal realizing its cage had been breached. The vibration of the walls intensified, becoming a frantic, high-pitched whirring that made my teeth hurt. And then, I heard the new sound. It came from deep inside the metal box, echoing off the empty walls. A rhythmic, frantic thump-thump-thump that was impossibly light, yet forceful. It sounded like something incredibly delicate, yet massive, was bouncing around inside the empty metal box, striking the walls repeatedly, trying desperately to escape the cold. It was fast, relentless, and filled with a sound of panic. It wasn't a heavy load shifting. It was the sound of a weight too light to register on the landing gear, but moving with such velocity and frequency that it caused the massive metal walls to shudder. I took a blind, Terrified stepped back, my flashlight beam shaking. The sound was like a trapped flock of birds, or perhaps a dozen large, light objects, all desperately hitting the walls, creating that unsettling, frantic percussion. Whatever it was furious, demanding to be kept cold, demanding to be secured. The temperature inside the box seemed to be dropping further, and the air rushing out now felt physically painful on my skin. The intense, high-pitched whine of the motor and the frantic thump-thump-thump of the unseen cargo merged into a single, terrifying chorus of mechanical and biological panic. I knew I had to close the doors. I felt a horrifying compulsion to reach inside and try to see what was causing the frantic movement, but the sheer, possessive coldness emanating from the interior warned me against it. I didn't want to become part of the cargo. With a desperate surge of strength, I reached out and grabbed the two heavy doors. I pulled them shut with a violent, metallic clang, the sound momentarily overwhelming the reefer unit's whine. I threw the latch bar down, shoving it with my shoulder until it clicked heavily into place. I didn't care if it was locked. I just needed the seal to hold. The instant the doors slammed shut, the frantic thump-thump-thump from the inside was muffled. But it continued, now sounding more desperate, more enraged, sealed inside its dark, cold prison. The reefer unit's high-pitched whine immediately dropped back to its original, low, deep, monotonous drone, vibrating the walls with steady, methodical malice, satisfied that the seal was secure once more. I stumbled backward, turning and running back toward my own rig, not daring to look back at the gleaming white trailer. I knew I had opened a door that should never have been touched, revealing a secret load that wanted no witnesses. I drove out of that gravel pit at full speed, never slowing down. I never reported the trailer. How do you tell authorities that you found an expensive piece of equipment running full blast to preserve a cargo that was too light to register, yet moved with the force of a frantic, captive thing? But years later, I still remember that sound. The sickening combination of the powerful diesel drone and the light, rapid, panicked thump-thump-thump hitting the metal walls. And sometimes, when I'm in my bunk and the night is quiet, I can still feel the profound, aggressive coldness of that empty trailer, knowing that whatever was inside, that frantic, furious cargo that was too light to weigh, is still sealed up, eternally preserved, bouncing off the walls of its cold, dark, metal cage, forever waiting for the driver who secured it and never came back. Let's move to the next story. The Mojave Desert late at night doesn't feel empty. It feels vast and indifferent. The moonlight so bright it casts hard, sharp shadows that play tricks on the eyes. The air is dry, thin, and carries sounds with an unnatural clarity. I was pushing a westward haul, crossing Nevada and heading into California when the fatigue hit me hard. I pulled into a wide, deserted asphalt lot, an old, closed-down truck wash facility that had long since been forgotten. I parked my rig and shut down the engine. The immense silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of my own cooling chrome. As my eyes adjusted to the brilliant, dusty moonlight, I noticed another truck parked maybe 100 feet away, nestled against a low, cinder block wall. It was a magnificent, custom sleeper rig, a massive, long-hooded conventional, gleaming faintly even under its coat of desert dust. The custom paint was immaculate. The chrome was heavy, and the sleeper box was huge. It looked like a machine costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, a rig clearly owned by someone with pride and money. Yet, it was sitting dead silent, looking utterly abandoned, an incongruous jewel of engineering in a field of cracked asphalt. I got out, drawn by the stark contrast between the machine's quality and its neglect. I walked slowly toward it, the desert wind whispering dryly past my ears. As I got closer, the stillness of the immaculate truck felt wrong. A machine like that should at least be humming. I reached the driver's side, cupped my hands around the dusty glass, and peered into the cab. The interior was perfect, clean leather, polished with grain, all the fittings exactly where they should be. It looked like the driver had stepped out 5 minutes ago. But then I saw the driver's seat. It was unnaturally low. The massive air ride suspension seat, the kind that cushions a driver against every bump, was completely bottomed out, sunk down to the floor, pressed against the metal base with a finality that looked painful. The leather was stretched taut and warped by an immense, impossible pressure. It looked as though a person of several tons had been sitting there. The suspension completely defeated, the cushion compressed to a few millimeters of thickness. I stared, baffled. Even the heaviest trucker couldn't compress a high-quality air seat that far without deliberately releasing all the air pressure. Yet the airlines and gauges looked untouched. It was a picture of extreme, focused weight. I tried the driver's door handle. To my surprise, it clicked open. The driver had left the door unlocked. I pushed it wide and climbed up into the cab, the movement creaking the chassis. The air inside was dead, hot, and thick with the heavy scent of old, expensive leather and something else, a faint, dusty smell like dried earth and sulfur. I stood there, looking at the impossibly low seat. I reached down and grabbed the lever on the side. The control used to reinflate the air cushion and raise the seat back to its normal height. I pulled it hard, but the seat didn't budge. It was completely seized, pressed to the floor with an unyielding, silent, immovable force. The lever was activated, but the weight holding the seat down was too great for the internal system to overcome. My fingers were resting on the lever. My body leaned over the center console when I heard the sound. It came from directly behind me, from the cavernous, darkened space of the custom sleeper bunk, separated from the cab only by a curtain that was currently pulled back. It was a slow, heavy inhalation, a deep, shuddering rasp of air being drawn in. A sound so close I felt the hair stand up on my neck, though the air around me remained absolutely still. It was the sound of something immense, something truly colossal, filling its lungs right there in the dark. It was a sound of profound, exhausted relief, as if the breathing had been suppressed for a long, long time. I froze, unable to move, my hand still resting on the useless seat lever. I was standing in the cab, leaning over the console, and whatever had made that inhalation was right there, inches from my back, resting in the sleeper bunk. I didn't dare turn around. The silence that followed the breath was worse than the sound. It was a heavy, patient stillness that seemed to indicate the being was now acutely aware of my presence. The terrifying truth snapped into focus. The driver wasn't just heavy. He was pressed into the vinyl of the driver's seat, where the remains of what he became were, and the weight hadn't lifted. The reason the seat was bottomed out was because the occupant was still there, sitting with an impossible gravity, and the being in the sleeper was its companion. As I struggled to regain control of my limbs, I heard a new sound coming from the seat beneath me. A faint, slow schlick, the sound of moist leather reluctantly peeling away from itself. It came from the top of the flattened seat, right where a massive back would meet the headrest. And then the voice. It was a low, dry rasp, like heavy fabric dragging across rough stone, emanating from the depths of the sleeper. "He's still sitting." The voice was matter-of-fact, calm, and impossibly deep. It wasn't accusatory, just a simple statement of fact. It acknowledged my presence and the state of the driver's seat. I yanked my hand off the lever, scrambling backward over the console and out the open door, falling heavily onto the cracked asphalt. I didn't stop to look at the sleeper. I didn't even look at the seat. I just ran. I threw myself back into my rig, locking the doors and starting the engine. As my headlights swept the immaculate, custom Peterbilt, I saw the driver's door was still hanging open, the opening a black, gaping maw. I drove out of that deserted lot at top speed. I glanced in my side mirror once, seeing the Peterbilt shrink into the darkness. Just before it vanished, I thought I saw a slight, sudden rise in the reflection of the driver's seat. Maybe an inch or two, as if the weight had shifted, or maybe, finally, a minuscule amount of air had managed to enter the compressed system. I drove all night, haunted by the memory of that impossible weight and the dry, heavy inhalation in the sleeper. I never reported the truck. Who would investigate a bottomed-out seat and a voice in the dark? But I know that custom rig is still out there, sitting in the dry desert, its suspension completely defeated. And I know the driver is still in his seat, pressed into the vinyl, waiting for the immense, unyielding weight of whatever got him to finally lift, so he can at last get out and finish his long, silent journey. Let's move to the next story. The valleys of the Oregon Cascades have a wet, chilling quality, even in the dead of summer. The mountain air, cool and dense, collects in the hollows, forming a fog so thick it feels less like vapor and more like a physical element poured over the landscape. I was running a load through a remote logging valley, the road winding through old-growth timber. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and the fog had settled in a deep, silent, disorienting white wall that reduced my visibility to about 10 feet. I was creeping along, fighting the urge to pull over entirely, when I saw a flicker of color off the shoulder. I slowed my rig, my tires crunching on the wet asphalt, and peered into the opaque white. Tucked deep into a small, overgrown pull-off, almost completely concealed by the close-set pines, was another truck. It was an old, flat-fronted cab over, the kind with the huge, rectangular windshield painted a faded, anonymous green. It looked ancient, abandoned, sunk into the damp earth, utterly derelict. My curiosity got the better of my fear. I pulled my own truck onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The silence was immediate, heavy, and wet, the fog absorbing every distant sound. I grabbed my mag light and stepped out into the swirling white mist. The fog was everywhere, thick and cold, clinging to the surrounding trees like cotton candy. As I walked toward the abandoned cab over, I noticed something strange about it. The truck itself, the paint and the metal, was wet with condensation, as expected. But the massive windshield was completely obscured by a dense, heavy layer of fog. Not condensation that forms on cold glass, but a clinging, opaque mist that looks somehow internal, radiating out from the glass itself. The rest of the truck, the side windows, the mirrors, were simply damp. Only the windshield was completely swallowed by this strange, internal cloud. I approached the driver's side, shining my light on the glass. The fog was so thick I couldn't see anything inside the cab, only the white curtain pressed against the glass. It looked less like water vapor and more like someone had dusted the glass heavily with fine white powder. It was an external, yet aggressively clinging, mist. I reached out with my heavy work glove and wiped a spot on the glass, using firm pressure. The spot I wiped was immediately clear, revealing the dark, dusty interior of the cab, a ruin of old vinyl and shredded foam. But the moment I lifted my hand away, the heavy fog rushed back in, coating the cleared spot instantly. It didn't roll in from the outside. It seemed to materialize on the glass, appearing from the inside out, spreading like a stain until the glass was once again completely opaque. I stood there, staring at the impossible act. I wiped the glass again, harder this time, creating a clean circle where I could briefly see the steering wheel and the dash. And again, the cold, heavy white cloud rushed in to smother the clear view, restoring the total blindness. I pressed my face against the clean spot before it vanished, trying to see deeper into the cab, trying to locate the source of the fog. Behind the glass in the deep shadows, I saw a vague, distorted shape, a hump of darkness that might have been a seat, or might have been a hunched form, completely blurred and indistinct, like a person struggling to move beneath a sheet of cling film. It looked like something massive was pushing against the windows from the inside, struggling to get free of a clinging, suffocating cloud that filled the cab itself. As I watched the white cloud coalesce once more, another phenomenon began. A single, clear track appeared on the glass, running down through the mist. It was a perfectly clean, thin line, running vertically from the top edge of the windshield to the bottom, cutting through the dense fog. It looked exactly like a tear track, and as I watched, another one appeared next to it, and then another, and another, following the first, all cutting through the opaque layer with impossible clarity. They weren't raindrops or runoff. They were too thin, too perfect, tracking down with slow, agonizing certainty. It was as if the driver, or what remained of the driver, was trapped inside that cab, and the very air was smothering him, preventing his last sight of the outside world, and he was weeping against the impenetrable prison of his own windshield. The tears weren't washing the fog away. They were simply tracing a desperate, clear line of despair through the smothering cloud. I raised my hand again, feeling a terrible compulsion to wipe the glass one more time, to make contact with the weeping. But before my glove touched the glass, the weeping intensified. The clear tracks became faster, thicker, crisscrossing the windshield in a chaotic, desperate pattern, accompanied by a faint, dry scraping sound coming from inside the cab. The sound of fingernails dragging across plastic or dry vinyl. It was the sound of complete, final panic. The entity inside was not just crying. It was clawing at the glass, desperate for a view, desperate for air, trapped in a relentless, suffocating environmental loop. I stumbled back, horrified, turning and running back toward the safety of my own rig. The feeling that whatever was trapped in that cab was utterly, hopelessly alive, fully conscious of its suffocation, was overwhelming. I threw myself back into my seat, locked the doors, and slammed the key into the ignition. As my massive engine roared to life, shattering the mountain's silence, I glanced at the cab over one last time. The weeping had stopped. The scratching had ceased. The windshield was once again completely, silently covered in the dense, heavy white cloud. But as my headlights swept over the truck, I saw a single, dark stain forming on the metal just beneath the driver's side door handle, a dark, viscous streak running down the clean white paint. It looked thick and heavy, like something organic being forced out by extreme pressure. I drove out of that valley as fast as I dared, the thick, white fog swirling behind me. I never reported the truck. Who would believe the report? But for years afterward, every time I drive into a valley and the fog starts to settle, I feel an intense coldness on my face. And I find myself instinctively wiping my own windshield, knowing that somewhere in the deep, wet valleys of the Cascades, that cab-over still sits, its massive windshield shrouded in an opaque, clinging mist, and the driver inside is still scratching at the glass, forever trapped behind a curtain of his own despair. Let's move to the next story. The old Pennsylvania Turnpike access points, especially the ones that run high into the Appalachian ridges, are often flanked by truck stops that look like they've been forgotten by time. They feel cold and perpetually damp. I was hauling a load of steel late one night, around 3 a.m., and pulled into one such overgrown, deserted lot. The asphalt was cracked, and weeds grew through the concrete. I parked my rig and shut down the engine. The air was thick and silent, heavy with the smell of wet pine and industrial decay. There were no other trucks, and the main building was a dark, boarded-up husk. As my eyes adjusted to the weak moonlight, I saw an anomaly near the back edge of the lot, right against the dense, dark tree line. It was an old, heavy-duty dump truck, painted a faded, anonymous maroon. It was sitting on flat, rotting tires, the dump bed half-tilted, clearly abandoned. I was instantly drawn to it. Abandoned rigs in places like this always feel like they're waiting to tell a story. I grabbed my flashlight and walked slowly across the gravel toward the tree line. The truck was covered in a thick layer of dust and moss. The passenger window was shattered, but the driver's side window was intact, though opaque with grime. But the odd thing, the first thing that really put a knot in my stomach, was the sun visor. On the driver's side, the heavy vinyl sun visor was pulled down completely, blocking the entire top half of the windshield and the side window. It was a perfectly normal action for blocking the glare of the setting sun, but it was 3 a.m., and the truck had been dead for years. Why was that visor down? It felt deliberate, a final, purposeful gesture frozen in time. I walked up to the driver's door, cupping my hands around the dusty glass and shining my light in. The interior was a disaster of dust and faded debris. I couldn't see anything clearly behind the lowered visor. I reached out and carefully touched the door handle. It was stiff, rusted shut. I knew I couldn't get the door open without a fight, but I had to see what was behind that vinyl screen. I reached up and pressed my fingertip against the visor's edge, applying the slightest bit of pressure, easing it upward just enough to create a crack of visibility into the cab. The instant I moved the visor, the beam of my flashlight fell upon something taped to the underside of it. It was a small, crudely cut-out photograph of a man's face. The photo was faded, a typical snapshot of a trucker, maybe 50s or 60s, wearing a baseball cap. The picture was taped to the visor, so that when the visor was down, The face was staring directly out the window, looking through the glass and into the outside darkness. But the face wasn't normal. It was stretched, distorted, and slightly warped, as if the paper had been damp when it was affixed to the vinyl, or as if the adhesive had slowly pulled the print out of shape. The features were elongated, the eyes wide and terrified, the mouth pulled into a grimace. It was the face of the missing driver, staring out with a silent, profound terror. And scrawled beneath the picture, directly on the visor's vinyl, in what looked like dried ink or perhaps a mixture of grit and blood, it was too dark to be certain, was a single, stark, defiant phrase written in thick, messy letters. "Don't look out." The warning was clear, simple, and utterly chilling. The visor hadn't been pulled down to block the sun. It had been pulled down to block the view, to stop anyone from looking out, and the driver's own terrified face was serving as a final, gruesome mask to cover the hole. I froze, my hands still holding the visor up, exposing the terrifying command. I stared at the stretched, wide-eyed picture and the desperate words scrawled beneath it. I realized the message wasn't a warning about what was in the truck. It was a warning about what was outside. Then, I heard a sound. It was faint, high-pitched, and rhythmic. A soft, continuous tap, 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 coming from the outside of the driver's side window, right where the visor had just been covering the glass. It wasn't the sound of rain. The night was dry. It wasn't tree branches. The truck was parked in the open. It was rhythmic, delicate, and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was right there, inches from my head. I realized whatever the driver had been so desperate to block his view of was still out there, on the other side of the glass, and it was now tapping. The tapping intensified slightly, and then it changed position. It began moving, slowly and agonizingly, up the glass. Tap, 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 moving vertically, following the arc of the missing visor, as if something was slowly climbing the glass, searching for the crack I had just created by lifting the vinyl. I let go of the visor instantly. It swung down with a silent thwack, snapping back into its protective, down position. The distorted, terrified face of the missing driver was once again staring out, covering the view. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and cold, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I backed away from the maroon dump truck, stumbling over the cracked concrete, never taking my eyes off the driver's window. I was terrified to turn around, convinced that whatever had been looking in, tapping its fingers on the glass, was now behind me, standing between me and my own rig. I reached my own cab, threw myself inside, and locked the doors, my hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. I forced myself to look into my side mirror. The abandoned dump truck was visible, dark and still, the visor pulled down like a closed eyelid. The empty lot behind me was completely silent. But as I watched, waiting for the courage to start my engine, I saw a movement near the abandoned truck's driver's side door. It was a shift of shadow, a blurring of the outline, and then a slow, deliberate trace of movement on the outside of the grime-covered door itself. A faint, dry scraping sound that even the thickness of my cab couldn't completely block out. It sounded like something very tall was slowly, deliberately running a hard, sharp edge down the maroon paint, confirming its presence. I didn't wait to see more. I cranked the engine and drove out of that deserted truck stop, flooring the accelerator. I drove for 2 hours, unable to shake the image of that warped, terrified face staring out from behind the visor. I never knew what the driver saw that made him tape his own horrified picture over the window and scratch out that command. But I know that his last, desperate act saved me from looking out at the thing that was quietly, persistently watching from the outside. And sometimes, when I'm pulling over for the night in a dark, silent place, I hear a faint, high-pitched tap, tap, tap on the glass of my own cab, and I always pull my sun visor down, knowing that the thing that looked in on that poor driver is still out there, still looking for an open, unprotected view. Let's move to the next story. The foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in East Tennessee, particularly the valleys where the logging trails intersect with the state highways, hold onto the darkness. When a moon is obscured, the shadows aren't just lack of light. They're a tangible, heavy presence. I was running a long haul of lumber through the twisting back roads, utterly exhausted. I pulled into a small, independent gas station I'd seen marked on an old map. It was barely lit, just a single, flickering fluorescent tube over the pumps, and it was completely deserted. I parked my rig, killed the engine, and the resulting silence felt immediately oppressive. After filling up, I walked around the back of the dilapidated concrete building to use the restroom. That's when I saw the other rig. It was a classic old-school sleeper truck, a long-nosed beast from the 1970s, painted a faded, anonymous blue. It was beat up with massive rust patches, flat tires sunk into the mud, and dusty, cracked windows. It had clearly been abandoned for years. What drew my attention, making me pause in the cold, wet air, were the jumper cables. Heavy-duty, thick-gauge cables, the kind used for massive truck batteries, were neatly attached to the abandoned rig's terminals. The red clamp was secured to the positive post, the black clamp to the negative. This, by itself, wasn't unusual. Maybe someone had tried to salvage it recently. But the other end of the cables, the end that should have been connected to a live battery or another vehicle, was not connected to anything at all. The thick, black and red wires were coiled up neatly on the damp ground, and the free clamps, the heavy, toothy metal jaws, were resting perfectly on the mud-packed asphalt, facing upward. I figured the driver or mechanic had simply given up and left the cables. But as I walked closer, shining my mag light on the scene, I noticed a detail that chilled me to the bone. The clamps at the free end, resting on the cold ground, were vibrating. Very faintly, a high-frequency buzz that I could feel in the air more than hear. The metallic teeth of the clamps were shuddering against the asphalt. I knelt down, trying to see if there was some mechanical reason, a loose engine part or a tremor. But the entire truck was dead still. Only the free, unhooked clamps were humming. I extended my hand toward the metal jaws. The air immediately around the clamps was noticeably warmer than the rest of the cold night air, an isolated bubble of warmth radiating from the contact points. And as my arm got closer, I felt a faint, prickly static charge on my skin, the unmistakable sensation of powerful electrical potential. The clamps were hot, vibrant, and alive, yet they were touching nothing but the cold, wet ground. I realized with a sickening jolt that the cables were not disconnected from the power source. They were connected to an impossible one. They were drawing energy, slowly, silently, from the earth itself, transferring a dark, primal power into the dead machine's battery. I reached out my index finger, intending to make contact with the tooth of the black, negative clamp. I had to know if it was really live. The instant my finger broke the warm, static bubble around the clamp, a sound erupted from the abandoned truck's engine block. It wasn't a sudden explosion or a grinding starter. It was a deep, sustained, low-frequency sound, a bass roar that seemed to originate not from the engine, but from the ground beneath it, traveling up through the tires and the chassis. It was a resonant, heavy roar that shook the air in my chest, a vibration so powerful it felt like the mountain was sighing deeply. The sound felt incredibly old, immense, and profoundly angry. It was the sound of the earth realizing its power source was being siphoned. I stumbled backward, pulling my hand away, though I hadn't even touched the clamp. The roaring lasted for maybe 5 seconds, intense and overwhelming, before slowly fading back into the oppressive silence. But the clamps were still vibrating. And now, the light of my flashlight revealed something else. Right around the jaws of the clamps, the asphalt had turned a darker, wetter shade, almost black, and thin trails of mist were rising from the contact point, as if the ground itself was sweating under the strain of being drained. I backed up further, staring at the sight. The cables weren't left there. They had been intentionally placed, connected to the dead machine, and the other end was systematically harvesting energy from the ground, transferring a silent, dark charge into the battery. I could see the thick red cable leading into the darkness of the engine bay, presumably charging the dead battery. I knew if I stayed there, I would witness the next terrifying stage of this process. The sound of the engine turning over, not with a mechanical sputter, but with the cold, resonant roar of a machine powered by something deeply wrong and primal. The thought of an antique, beat-up rig starting up in the dead of night, powered by the life force of the earth, its headlights illuminating the horror that had placed those cables, was enough to send me sprinting. I scrambled back to my own rig, threw the key in the ignition, and drove out of that dimly lit station without looking in the rearview mirror. I drove for 50 miles, never looking back. But for years afterward, every time I pull over for a break in a remote area, I have to fight the compulsion to get out of my cab and look at the ground beneath my own tires to check for signs of moisture, for that thick, black earth sweat. And sometimes, when I'm parked and the air brakes hiss out their final puff, I hear a deep, low-frequency sound that seems to vibrate the asphalt, a phantom, subterranean roar that reminds me that somewhere in those Tennessee foothills, there's a derelict truck with heavy jumper cables still attached to its terminals, patiently coiled on the ground, waiting for the battery to be fully charged by a power source that should never be disturbed. And I know that when the battery is finally full, that engine will start, and the driver who placed those cables will finally be ready to drive on, pulled by the terrifying, silent current of the Appalachian earth. Let's move to the next story. The high desert plateau of Arizona. Once you veer off the main interstate and onto the old secondary highways, is a landscape of unrelenting silence and massive, empty distance. The moonlight, when the sky is clear, is harsh and cold, casting shadows that seem too sharp to be real. I was running a westward haul, pushing hard through the early morning hours, the road ahead of me black and winding between the rocky hills. Around 3 a.m., I spotted something unusual pulled off onto the shoulder, a semi-truck. It was a late-model black, conventional, a massive machine with a gleaming aerodynamic sleeper. It looked expensive, less than a year old, and it was sitting dead still without lights, angled slightly against the slope. The entire rig was listing subtly on its suspension, as if one side was weighed down or the airbags were unevenly deflated. The sight of a high-end truck simply abandoned like that was immediately suspicious. I slowed my rig, pulled onto the dusty shoulder, maybe 50 feet behind it, and cut my engine. The resulting silence was instant, dry, and heavy with the scent of dust and cold scrub brush. I grabbed my heavy mag light and stepped out. The air was cold, and my boots crunched loudly on the gravel. I walked slowly toward the black rig, my light sweeping the cab. The driver's side door was wide open, hanging slightly ajar, exposing the dark interior. I approached the open door cautiously, shining my light inside. The cab was immaculate, clean leather, polished wood grain, everything neat and organized. It looked like the driver had stepped out for a moment and simply forgotten to shut the door. But what drew my eyes, freezing my blood instantly, was the wallet. A thick, dark leather trucker's wallet was sitting perfectly centered on the driver's air ride seat. It was open, slightly, revealing a crisp stack of bills, 20s and 50s, and the clear plastic window holding a driver's license photo, staring straight up at the ceiling. The seat itself was spotless, the perfect, untouched leather surface serving as a pedestal for this blatant, terrifying lure. The wallet looked full, untouched, and utterly exposed. It was the last thing any professional driver would leave behind when stepping out of the cab, especially in the middle of nowhere. It felt less like an accidental forgetfulness and more like a deliberate, chilling offering. I climbed up onto the bottom step, leaning into the cab, keeping my light steady on the wallet. I reached out a tentative hand, intending to grab the wallet, close it, and call the authorities to report the missing driver. My fingers brushed the cool, smooth leather of the wallet's edge, and at that precise moment of contact, the wallet moved. Subtly, a soft, barely perceptible slide, maybe a quarter of an inch, across the smooth leather of the seat. It didn't roll or tumble. It slid smoothly and horizontally, moving just enough to pull its edge away from my fingertips. The open edges of the wallet seemed to close slightly as it moved, like an eye blinking. I gasped, pulling my hand back. The adrenaline rushed through me, cold and sharp. The seat was level, stationary. There was no wind inside the cab. I looked down at the wallet. It was resting on the seat, a quarter-inch further back than where I had originally touched it. The movement was too fluid, too purposeful to be static electricity or an accident. I tried again, slower this time, my fingers hovering an eighth of an inch above the leather. I pushed my hand forward, intending to quickly clamp down on the object. And again, the wallet subtly slid, maintaining that frustrating, unnerving distance. It moved with the motion of my approach, perfectly choreographed, keeping its contents, the money and the cold, unblinking driver's license photo, visible but just out of reach. It was being purposefully drawn back, an anchor, an impossible tether. The realization settled over me with a crushing weight. The wallet wasn't just left there, it was being held there. The weight of the missing driver's spirit, or something that now owned his essence, was tied to that object, and the simple act of trying to take it was activating the unseen force. I backed down a step, my light still fixed on the object. The wallet remained centered on the seat, the crisp bills and the driver's photo staring out into the dark. It was a perfect, chilling lure set on a perfect empty stage. As I stood there, staring into the cab, I noticed the cab's air ride suspension. The truck was listing, as I had noted, heavily on the passenger side. I looked at the driver's seat again. The wallet was centered, but the seat cushion itself looked unevenly pressed, not bottomed out, but slightly depressed, as if a weight was sitting on the extreme left side of the seat, right where a hip might rest. And then I heard a sound from the sleeper bunk, which was separated from the cab by a thick, dark curtain. It was a light, dry sigh, a whisper of exhaled air that was immediately absorbed by the expensive fabric of the walls. It was barely audible, but deeply intimate. It was the sound of something patient, something that knew I had fallen for the lure. I grabbed the open door of the rig and slammed it shut with a heavy clang. I didn't care if the door latched. I just needed the cab to be closed. The instant the metal met metal, the wallet reacted. It didn't slide, but it snapped shut with a dry thwack, silencing the exposed money and obscuring the driver's photo. It was the sound of a trap being sprung, the lure removed because the intruder had retreated. I scrambled backward, running back toward my own rig. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove out of that turnout without hesitation. I didn't use my headlights until I was back on the main road, afraid of what the sudden light might reveal in the mirrors. I drove until the relentless Arizona sunrise flooded the desert, painting the rocks in warm colors. I never reported the truck. I knew they wouldn't find a wreck, only a pristine black rig with a full wallet sitting innocently on the seat. But for years afterward, every time I pull over on a deserted road, I look twice at the ground. I never leave anything valuable in plain sight. And I know that somewhere on that empty highway, that perfect black custom sleeper is still sitting, silently listing on its suspension, and inside, a thick leather wallet is resting on the seat, waiting patiently to be touched. Let's move to the next story. The summer of 19 was brutal for driving. Not just the heat, which was a suffocating, wet blanket even crossing into the North Country, but the deadlines. My dispatcher, a sour man named Lenny, had me running a refrigerated load of pharmaceutical from Philly up to Bangor, Maine, and the clock was ticking down like a bomb. It was a route I knew well enough, but this time, the mandatory rest period was going to hit me in the worst possible spot. Around 3 a.m., after 18 straight hours on the road, my electronic logging device started chirping that high-pitched warning. I was running low on hours, and I needed to stop immediately. I just passed a junction for a forgotten stretch of logging road. Highway 16, they called it, just a faint cracked line on the map that looped back toward the main artery in about 50 miles. It was secluded, sure, but it looked quiet, and honestly, I was too bone-tired to argue with the satellite. I slowed the big Peterbilt down, threw the blinker on, and pulled onto the shoulder of that asphalt. It was immediately darker than I expected. The tall pines of northern Maine closed in tight, their boughs heavy and wet with the night's humidity, swallowing the moonlight completely. When I shut down the diesel engine, the silence was almost painful, a dense, oppressive quiet broken only by the chirping of a million unseen insects and the slow, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling off. I checked the perimeter with my mag light. No houses, no lights, no other rigs, just trees, road, and black air. I climbed into the sleeper berth, kicked off my boots, and cranked the AC down as far as it would go. It struggled against the thick, swampy heat, rattling the small window latch, but the cold air eventually started to build up. I was asleep within minutes, the exhaustion winning this silent battle with my nerves. I woke up suddenly around 4:30 a.m. with that heart jerk, adrenaline spike feeling you get when you realize something is deeply wrong. The AC was still rattling, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating despite the cold. It was the smell that did it. It wasn't the chemical scent of the truck stop or the pine air. It was the smell of stale, unfiltered tobacco smoke, the kind that hangs in cheap bars and old, uncleaned wool coats. It was the exact smell of the cheap, off-brand cigarettes my father chain-smoked right up until the day he died 10 years ago. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, AC, tracked down my spine. I lay there for a long time, completely motionless, trying to rationalize it away. Maybe I dreamt it. Maybe the smell had clung to a jacket I hadn't noticed. But then I heard the sound. Clink, clink, clink. It was faint, metallic, and impossibly rhythmic, coming from the cab, just over the divider curtain. It wasn't the truck settling. I knew every groan and sigh that old rig made. This sound was deliberate, quiet, and busy, like someone was tinkering with something small and metal. I slowly, painstakingly lifted my head off the pillow, my neck muscles screaming from the tension. The air in the sleeper felt charged, every nerve ending alert. The smell of smoke was definitely stronger now, right in the cab, right on the other side of the partition. I eased myself up onto one elbow, making less noise than a whisper. My breath hitched in my throat. I pushed the curtain back just an inch, enough for my eye to peer through the gap. The cab was nearly pitch black, but my eyes were fully adjusted to the darkness after hours of driving. There was a silhouette in the passenger seat. It was a man, large and heavy-set, slumped slightly toward the passenger side door. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, and his profile was just a dark, motionless mass against the slightly less dark backdrop of the window glass. He was sitting completely still, too still, with his back squarely toward me. I knew, with a certainty that iced my blood, that he hadn't been there when I parked. The doors had been locked. I hadn't heard a sound of entry. The clink, clink, clink continued. I focused on his hands, which were moving slowly in the darkness near his knees. They were fiddling with an object resting on the floorboard. I could make out the faint, blocky shape of an old, rusted metal lunchbox, the kind construction workers carried 70 years ago. The rhythmic clinking was the sound of his fingers running over the rough, pitted metal, maybe picking at a latch or a dent. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My chest felt like it was encased in concrete. This wasn't a hitchhiker, and this wasn't a thief. The way he was sitting, the sheer density of the silence he carried, felt wrong, fundamentally unnatural. He wasn't breathing, or at least I couldn't hear it over the frantic thumping of my own heart. He was just there, a cold, smoking presence, meticulously tracing the surface of that metal box in the deep, remote night. The realization that I was utterly alone, 30 miles from the nearest house, and trapped a few feet from something that defied explanation, was soul-crushing. An eternity passed. I kept my eye glued to the gap in the curtain, watching the profile of the cap and the endless, mindless movement of his hands on the metal. I was trying to find a seam in the reality of the situation, a way to make it make sense. Maybe it was a hallucination from exhaustion, maybe a sudden onset of fever, but the smell of that smoke was too real, too specific to my father, who had never driven a truck in his life. The clinking sound was the anchor in the nightmare. Then, the truck violently shuddered. It wasn't a wind gust or a car passing. It was a single, heavy, impossible jolt that ran from the front bumper straight to the back axle, shaking the entire cab like a dog shaking a rag doll. At the exact moment of the shudder, the man's hands stopped their work and the metal lunchbox slipped from his grip. It hit the thick rubber floor mat with a loud, hollow clang that echoed in the tiny space of the cab. The smell of smoke vanished instantly, as if a door had been slammed on a fireplace flue. The presence, that cold, suffocating weight, was gone. The passenger seat was empty. My entire body broke out in a sweat, my muscles finally giving way to movement. I tumbled out of the sleeper and into the driver's seat, scrambling for the keys. I fumbled them into the ignition and fired the big diesel engine. The sound was deafening, a roar of life cutting through the terrifying quiet. I didn't bother looking back at the logging road. I slammed the shifter into drive and rolled that truck out, tires spitting gravel onto the shoulder. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I drove for another 2 hours without stopping, adrenaline pouring over the exhaustion, until I hit the lights of a 24-hour gas station on the main highway. I pulled into a spot far from the pumps and finally shut down the engine, my hands cramped and white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I had to look. I had to know if I was insane. I shone my mag light slowly across the passenger seat. It was empty, just as I'd known it would be. But when the beam dropped to the floorboard, my heart seized again. There, resting against the transmission hump, was a rusted, dented, dark green metal lunchbox. It was old, certainly, with a broken, thin wire handle and a latch mechanism that looked like it hadn't worked since the 1940s. It was the exact shape and size of the object the silhouette had been fiddling with. I didn't touch it. I didn't open it. I just stared at the metallic sheen in the flashlight beam, the object solidifying the terror of the previous hour into a physical, undeniable reality. I called Lenny and told him I'd hit my hours and would be delayed. I couldn't tell him why. I spent the next 4 hours sitting rigid in the driver's seat, the sun slowly coming up, casting long shadows of the pine trees into the cab. The sunlight felt thin and ineffective against the cold dread that the box represented. When the sun was fully above the horizon, washing the cab in pale, yellow light, I took a trash bag, used my jacket sleeve to nudge the lunchbox into it, tied the bag in a tight knot, and threw it into the station dumpster as I drove past. I never told anyone the full story. I changed companies 3 weeks later, got a different route, and even bought a newer rig, a bright red Freightliner. But sometimes when I'm running late and the lights are off and the big truck is cruising through some remote, wooded corner of the country, I catch a faint, momentary whiff of stale cigarette smoke. And every single time, I find myself compulsively shining my phone light down at the passenger floor mat, just to be sure that space is truly empty. The fear isn't of seeing the man again. The fear is of what he might have left behind this time. Let's move to the next story. The job paid triple the usual rate for a 3-day run. That was the first warning sign, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. My dispatcher, a kid fresh out of college who was always trying to prove himself, was vague on the details, just calling it a priority pharmaceutical shipment that had to go from a secure warehouse outside Houston to a drop point near Chicago. The paperwork was almost non-existent, just a bill of lading with a single line, high-value industrial components. I picked up the container late on a stifling Tuesday afternoon. It was a standard 53-foot dry van, sealed with a thick, government-issue metal lock and a paper tamper-proof strip that confirmed it hadn't been opened since the dock. Everything looked routine, if suspiciously quiet. But the moment I coupled up and pulled away, the trailer felt heavy, not just physically, but somehow energetically, like a dead weight dragging behind me. It felt cold, too, despite sitting under the Texas sun all day. I pushed hard through the first night and made it into central Illinois by Wednesday evening. I was ahead of schedule, but the exhaustion was setting in. I pulled into a massive, but relatively empty, rest area, one of those desolate concrete islands surrounded by miles of cornfields and dark, heavy woods. I parked my rig alongside a few other sleepers, killed the engine, and started my pre-sleep routine. I remember stepping out onto the asphalt. The summer air was thick and humid, but the silence was profound, the kind of stillness that pushes in on your ears and makes you think you're underwater. I checked the container seal one last time. It was intact, the paper strip showing no sign of breakage. I climbed back in a cab, set my alarm for 4 hours, and passed out immediately. I woke up exactly at midnight, not to the alarm, but to a feeling that clawed its way up from the soles of my feet. It was a vibration, a low, deep, physical hum coming directly from the trailer behind me. It wasn't the sound of the refrigeration unit. This wasn't a reefer van, and the sound was organic, not mechanical. It was more like the resonant buzz of a very large, deeply disturbed insect hive, or maybe the low, painful drone of a distant, massive tuning fork. It vibrated up through the cab floor, through the mattress, and into my bones. I lay there for a long minute, tried to convince myself it was the idling engine of the truck parked next to me, but the hum was too concentrated, too precisely centered right behind my head. Fear gave way to a cold, creeping dread. I sat up, grabbed my heavy-duty mag light, and slipped out of the cab. The night was absolute black, the humidity pressing down like a weight. The only sound in the huge rest area was that unnatural, resonating hum coming from my trailer. It was louder now that I was outside, a vibrating that seemed to be traveling through the steel frame itself. As I walked slowly back toward the twin doors of the container, I noticed the air immediately around the trailer was distinctly colder than the surrounding humid night. It wasn't a draft. It was an aura of localized, unnatural chill, centered entirely on the metal box. I felt the fine hairs on my arms stand up as I approached the rear bumper. I raised a flashlight and placed the powerful beam on the cargo doors. And then the humming stopped. Instantly. Completely. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. I stood there, mag light trembling slightly in my hand, listening to the rushing of my own blood in my ears. The cold air remained, clinging to the container like a shroud. I took a hesitant step closer, shining the light on the seal. Still perfect, unbroken. The silence lasted for maybe 10 seconds, and then it was replaced by a new sound, one that made me physically recoil. It was a wet, heavy, scraping noise coming from inside the sealed metal box. It was the sound of something large, heavy, and very soft being slowly dragged, inch by painful inch, across the rough, ribbed floor of the container. It was slow, deliberate, and sickeningly fleshy. There was a faint sound of exertion accompanying the dragging, a muted, guttural sound like a low moan or a suppressed grunt of immense effort. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my feet were locked to the asphalt. I leaned in toward the steel door, desperately trying to determine the nature of the object moving inside. Was it an animal? A person? The scraping stopped right in front of my face, on the other side of the corrugated steel. I could feel the cold radiating outward, and the air here was thick with a strange, coppery smell. Not quite blood, but something metallic and organic. Then, the whisper started. It was a faint, raspy sound, so close to the metal that it seemed to vibrate against the steel. It was muffled, indistinct, and chillingly intimate, like someone speaking directly into my ear through a sheet of cloth. It sounded like a man, but the voice was too dry, too strained, too old. He wasn't talking to me. He was listing things, reciting them under his breath. I could only make out fragments of words, mostly common nouns, repeated in slow, almost sing-song cadence. Stone anchor, rope, water, and I was hyperventilating, pressing myself against the rear of my truck's fender, trying to put distance between myself and the sound. The recitation continued, getting marginally louder, clearer, and closer to my position near the seal. Then, 2 words cut through the muffled drone, striking me with the force of a blow because they were perfectly clear, perfectly enunciated, and utterly wrong for the context. Michael Jenkins. Michael Jenkins was the name of the dispatcher who had called me about this load. The blood drained from my face. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the seam of the doors. I had not mentioned the name of the dispatcher to anyone. He hadn't even been on the paperwork. The whispering continued, now a torrent of names, all delivered in that dry, exhausted rasp. I didn't recognize any of them, but I knew, instinctively, that they were names of the men who had been called upon to move this cargo, men who had touched the bill of lading, men who were now part of the history of the thing inside the box. I didn't wait to hear my own name. I didn't need to. I turned and bolted for the cab, fumbling for the door handle, then scrambling inside. I locked the doors, flipped the interior lights off, and ducked down below the level of the dashboard, trembling violently. I waited for the movement, the sound of the creature outside, but there was only the immense, cold silence and the knowledge that something was standing on the other side of the cab door, listening to my terrified breathing. I couldn't start the truck. The thought of sitting there, engine running, while whatever came around to the windshield, paralyzed me. I waited until the first gray hint of dawn began to seep into the eastern sky. When the darkness began to thin, I risked a look in the side mirror. Nothing. The lot was still quiet, the other trucks still parked. I cranked the engine, a sound of defiant normality, and didn't look back again. I put the truck in gear and left the rest stop like a shot, accelerating down the highway until the container was nothing more than a blur in my mirrors. I didn't stop for gas or food until I was well into Ohio, 3 states removed from the quiet woods of Illinois. The drop-off point was exactly as described, an abandoned, weed-choked gravel lot behind a massive, derelict brick factory outside of a small Chicago suburb. A single tow motor operator, a quiet, pale man in grease-stained overalls, was waiting there. He didn't ask questions. I backed the trailer up to the designated spot, set the air brakes, and walked back to unhook. The cold aura around the trailer was gone in the morning light, but the metallic smell still faintly lingered. I looked at the twin doors one last time. The seals were impossibly still intact. The paper strip was unbroken, but the doors themselves, the heavy, corrugated steel doors, were bowed outward in the middle, visibly warped, as if something of immense size and density had spent hours leaning its entire weight against the metal, pushing and pressing to get out. The metal was stressed, almost tearing, but it had held. I unhitched the trailer, threw the keys at the pale man, and walked away. He asked me to sign the final manifest. I told him I wouldn't touch a piece of paper associated with that cargo. I called my company from a payphone at the nearest gas station, told them I was resigning, effective immediately, and that they could have the truck. I never drove another commercial load again. To this day, I occasionally look up the dispatcher, Michael Jenkins, on social media, just to make sure his name hasn't made it onto a different kind of list. Every time, I still see his face, and I know that the thing I haul, whatever it was, is still out there, sitting in that gravel lot, waiting for its next set of papers. Let's move to the last story. The Arizona run, even in mid-July, is mostly a straight shot of nothingness after the sun goes down. The heat drains out of the asphalt and into the desert air, and the silence settles in, interrupted only by the steady, hypnotic drone of the Cummins engine. That night, I was pushing the limit. I'd been on the road since early morning, hauling a load of agricultural equipment that needed to be in Bakersfield by sunup, and my hours were dwindling fast. My ELD was screaming its digital protest. I was looking for any safe patch of shoulder or a dimly lit truck stop, but the highway was barren. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw a set of dim, yellowish lights on the horizon, just where the highway curved around a ridge of jagged hills. Moments later, a wooden sign, bleached white and heavily weathered, appeared in my headlights. Ironwood Canyon Truck Stop, Diesel and Diner. I'd run this route for 5 years and had never seen or heard of the place. It wasn't on my GPS or my paper map, but I was out of options. I pulled the Big Kenworth off the highway and onto a long, cracked asphalt access road that led into a wide, open lot. As I rolled to a stop, I felt a deep sense of wrongness. The place was almost entirely deserted. The main building, a low, flat structure that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Eisenhower administration, was completely dark. There was no sign of a diner or any active business. The parking lot, big enough for 50 rigs, held maybe 3 vehicles, 2 rusted-out flatbed trailers that looked like they'd been abandoned years ago, their tires flat and their metal oxidized, and 1 old, long-nosed Kenworth that sat idling near the entrance, its yellow running lights casting an eerie, stagnant glow. But that was it. No other movement, no running engines, no light from the windows. Just profound, heavy silence. I pulled into a central spot, killed the engine, and the sudden, total quiet was deafening. Even the desert crickets seemed to have shut up. I locked the cab doors, grabbed my powerful magnetic flashlight, and decided to do a quick walk-around before settling into the sleeper. My first priority was checking the rear tires, a common ritual, but it was really just an excuse to look around and shake off the unsettling atmosphere. I walked the length of the trailer and dropped down by the dual fuel tanks just as I reached the middle of the rig. My truck was an older model, and the fuel tanks were polished aluminum chrome, shiny enough to hold a mirror-like reflection. I knelt down to inspect the tire pressure, and as I did, I glanced at the reflection in the curved surface of the tank. What I saw wasn't right. The reflection in the chrome tank showed a completely different scene behind me. Instead of the few rusted trailers and the single idling Kenworth I knew were there, the tank's surface showed a packed, bustling parking lot. I saw at least 25 heavy-duty trucks, their chrome glinting under bright sodium vapor lamps that weren't actually visible in the real lot. The reflection was full of life. Drivers in white t-shirts leaning against their doors, smoking. A small group of figures standing near what looked like an open grill, the smoke hazy in the reflected air. Even what looked like a small child running between the tires of two mirrored trailers. It was a thriving, active, mid-century truck stop, full of movement and noise, all perfectly rendered in the highly polished chrome surface of my fuel tank. My heart started thudding hard against my ribs. I straightened up abruptly, spinning around to face the actual parking lot. It was exactly as I'd seen before. Dark, silent, empty, save for the 3 abandoned wrecks and the 1 idling truck near the entrance. The low, flat building was still a black, vacant outline against the ridge. The air was cold and empty. I looked back down at the reflection in the tank. The bustling, crowded scene was still there, utterly clear and vibrant. It was like looking through a window into a different time, or perhaps a different reality, where the Ironwood Canyon truck stop was alive and booming. The discrepancy was physically jarring, an immediate assault on my senses. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on the cold chrome. The surface felt solid, just polished metal. Yet it was holding an image that defied the physical space around me. As I stared, the activity in the reflection began to change. Slowly, deliberately, the movement stopped. One by one, the dozens of figures in the reflection, the men smoking, the cook by the grill, the figures walking toward the non-existent diner, all ceased moving. They stopped talking, they dropped their shoulders, and they turned their reflected, dark faces toward me. Every single person in the crowded, phantom truck stop was now staring directly out of the chrome tank at my kneeling form. Their faces weren't clear. They were shadowy, indistinct, as if they were standing in perpetual twilight, but their reflected eyes were fixed on me with an uncanny, knowing stillness. I was no longer a viewer of a past scene. I was now the focal point of their attention. The lights in the reflection seemed to intensify, burning white-hot, making the shadows on their faces deepen. I started to back away slowly, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, one of the reflected figures, a large man in faded denim overalls and a wide-brimmed cap, who was standing closest to the mirrored surface, slowly raised his arm. It was a terribly slow movement, agonizingly deliberate. I watched his reflected hand reach the inner surface of the chrome tank. He did not pass through the metal, nor did the reflection blur. His hand simply reached the mirrored wall, and then, slowly, his reflected index finger began to tap on the inside of the chrome, right where the reflection of my own face was warped and distorted. Tap, tap, tap. His reflection eyes never left mine. The sound of the tap, a tiny, physical ping, should not have existed. The sound was not reflected. It was real, a minute sound transmitting through the solid metal into the silent night air. It was a sound that told me the barrier between my world and theirs was incredibly thin enough for a tap. All the blood rushed from my head. Logic, exhaustion, and confusion were immediately replaced by pure, paralyzing terror. I didn't care about my hours or my load. I didn't even think to unlock the door. I scrambled up, lunged for the cab, and threw myself inside, slamming the heavy door shut. I locked it, pulled the heavy curtain across the windshield, and slumped in the driver's seat, pressing my back against the cold vinyl. I couldn't bring myself to turn the key. The thought of that engine starting, the big truck roaring to life, announcing my presence, felt like inviting whatever was in that reflection to come closer. I could feel the presence of the full, busy lot outside, though I knew the physical lot was empty. I gripped the shifter, took my foot off the brake, and shoved the transmission into neutral. The Kenworth, being on the slightest of downhill grades, began to silently coast forward. I let gravity and the gentle slope of the access road carry me out of the lot. I didn't look at my side mirrors, knowing the chrome would show the packed, staring crowd. I didn't touch the accelerator until I felt the tires rumble over the cracks of the main highway. Only then did I key the ignition and mash the pedal to the floor, driving as fast as the heavy truck would let me, leaving the dark, quiet, crowded truck stop behind. I drove until the sunrise burned away the last vestiges of night. When the golden morning light finally filled the cab, I stopped at the next big, legitimate travel center. I got out, walked to the fuel tank, and looked at the chrome surface. Now, it only reflected the endless, bright Arizona desert and the clear blue sky. The bustling, silent crowd was gone, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of cold dread and the understanding that I had, for a terrifying hour, been visible to something that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. Something that still watched me from the depths of polished metal. I sold that truck 6 months later, and to this day, I avoid any chrome finish that's too reflective.